Hey, Club Scouts, if you like this episode, there's much more Roswell content on our Patreon. Listen to our 3-part companion series, Roswell Detours, the strange but true story of the Roswell Slides, our Roswell Movie Club episode, and our take on the infamous 1990s alien autopsy video with special guest Mike Carlson from Podcast The Ride. All of these episodes are available exclusively on BCC The Other Side. To subscribe, go to patreon.com/BigfootCollectorsClub.
Bigfoot Collectors Club presents Red Hot Alien Summer 2 Summer Abduction.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Bigfoot Collectors Club, the show where we talk to amazing guests about their stories of high strangeness that happened to them personally, something like that. Guys, I don't know, because it's our week off. I'm your host, Michael McMillan. With me always is your other host,
Bryce Johnson.
And like I said, it's our week off, but we just wanted to swing by because we have a special collector's item episode for you this week. Bryce, do you know what it is the 74th anniversary of?
Yeah, dude, you're talking about none other than the Roswell crash.
That's right. And as you may remember, last summer we did a mega 3-part series called the Roswell Saga. It was our first big deep dive. And for the first time ever, Riley and Bryce and I have gotten together and we've cut all 3 parts of those high strangeness chapters into one Roswell Supercut. And that's what you're going to hear today.
That's right. None of the, we cut off the fat, as they say in the biz.
That's right. So if you've never heard these episodes before, there will be stuff in it that are in those episodes that are not in this cut. This is just the fat Roswell steak. It's
oh my
the
God,
juicy, or I should say lean Roswell steak. We already said we cut the fat.
I'm having the most absurd deja vu right now. The trimming the fat and the steak and the Roswell steak and alien meat, it's all just like flooding back to me. I think we've done this before on an alternate timeline somewhere.
Yeah, I think we have too. All right, we got to get out of here. We're not supposed to be here. Guys, enjoy the Roswell Supercut. We will be back next week with an all-new episode of BCC. Until then, good night.
And go get regressed.
Roswell!
Yeah!
Hit it, Riley! All right, boys, here we go. It's Roswell. We're kicking off our Roswell High Strangeness. This could go for, honestly, it could be the rest of the series with as much information about Roswell that there is out there. It's
a lot.
Crazy. There's so much stuff. I think it is the most widely reported, investigated, talked about UFO story of all time. So there's just
hands down
tons of shit out there. It's in, and then just all the times it pops up in pop culture. We're going to get to that eventually, but I kind of wanted to kick off this series by asking both of you, and Riley, maybe we'll start with you because you're not the one that's been consuming all this crap for the past few weeks. What is your take, or what do you know about Roswell before we get into all of this?
To be quite honest, what I know about Roswell is not a lot. I know it was in 47, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Okay, yeah. A crash or alleged crash in a town outside of Roswell somewhere, and that it was reported in the papers immediately, and then that story was redacted and an official military story came out. And then that there's some people say there's bodies there, but that's pretty much the extent of what I know. I know about it from X-Files when I was a kid. It's sort of that first alien paranormal story you hear, that
totally
kind of gets you going on everything. But I would say beyond that, I haven't done a tremendous amount of research on it. I don't really know much.
But
I'd say that's pretty good.
That's it. I mean, that is the story in a nutshell. And on the surface, this is what's so fascinating about this case, because on the surface, it's very simple. You know what I mean? You can explain the whole story in 2 or 3 sentences. But then once you start to look closer, it just becomes this quagmire of different witnesses, different people, all these intersecting narratives. The timeline is weird. There are contradictions all over the place. And, you know, this has been now a big topic of research really in ufology for about 40 years now.
Yeah.
And there's been
I think we're going to talk about some of those contradictions and stuff. And
we have to. You can't talk Roswell without talking about the contradictions. But yeah, I was the same way, Riley. I mean, I knew a little bit more about it than I think the average, listener to this show. I knew some of the big names and the people involved. I've been to Roswell. I took a tour with a guy named Dennis Balthazar, and he was super rad, drove me and my buddy around Roswell, pointed out all the historical sites that are still there. Unfortunately, a lot of these places are being torn down. Half the old airfield base is basically, because it's no longer an active Army base. So the hangar where they supposedly brought the wreckage is still there, but like the hospital where they allegedly
dissected the bodies,
dissected aliens, and maybe tried to save one of the aliens, maybe did save one of the aliens. That's gone now. The newspaper, the Daily Record office is still there, but a lot of these historical sites are being taken down. And it was really, for me, it was that tour and listening to Dennis tell the story sort of in, obviously not in real time, but getting to drive around and see some of the houses that belong to some of the main players. It really brought the story to life. And it was the first time that I heard it and went, you know what? I think this was actually possible because, and Bryce and I were just talking about this before we recorded, there was no precedent, there was no protocol in 1947 for what should happen if a UFO crash landed somewhere. And what I think this story shows is the Army, the military in Washington figuring out how to respond to this. If it is what we want to believe it is, we're watching them figure out how to contain this story and deal with the reality of a crashed UFO with aliens in it, and how to deal with that.
Let me add to that. While there was no precedent set for something like this happening, all the facilities and all the compartmentalization was already in place. I mean, we were coming just off of the heels of World War II, creating the Manhattan Project, which created the first atomic bombs. And, people working on that project, nobody knew what the other one was doing. And there were hundreds of engineers and scientists working on that project, but yet nobody really know entirely the big picture of what they were working on. So the apparatus of compartmentalization was already in place and perfect for something like a crashed spaceship to happen.
Totally a fantastic point. I mean, when you read these stories and when you listen to some of these eyewitness accounts, it's a tough thing because one character knows one piece of information, another character in the story will have witnessed something else. It's like everyone in the town of Roswell that was involved is holding one piece of the puzzle, and researchers have been trying to put that puzzle together to get a complete image for 40 years now. And now all these witnesses are gone, basically, and even some of their children and second and third hand witnesses have passed on. So it's a story that's really erasing with time. You know what I mean? So it's part of this is like trying to preserve the narrative as best as possible.
Stanton Friedman said, and I love this quote, "Researching Roswell is a race with the Undertaker." And he's absolutely right. All the people who had firsthand knowledge or who were there are dying. I mean, there's less than a handful of them today.
Yeah, and one more point on this too is that I thought you brought up nicely that there was no precedent at the time, there was no protocol, but I do think what happened at Roswell set the protocol moving forward for the government's role in covering up information about UFOs. And we're seeing, we're in the middle of this summer now where it's come back around and it's really popular and people are talking about disclosure. Everything that's happening in the news today, you can trace all of that back. All the Pentagon secret programs, all this stuff, all the whistleblowers, it all leads back to Roswell. So this is really like the point.
It was just last month, New York Times released an article about possible crashed retrieval programs. So you're exactly right. All of this is coming back full circle in our faces today. And there's really a paradigm shift. People view UFOs and crashed spaceships differently today than they did 50 years ago.
So, Bryce, before we start, we didn't hear your background with Roswell. Do you ever remember a time when you didn't know what Roswell was? Because I feel like I've always sort of known about it.
Yeah, I feel like that too, right? I feel like, like you said earlier, this had to be the biggest, quote unquote, alien spaceship, alien body event ever to happen. And especially right here in our own backyard in New Mexico. Roswell represented to me the idea that this was going to be our best chance at actually proving that we are being visited by extraterrestrial beings. And it also represented to me the idea that our government, doesn't want us to know about it, or better yet, they don't think we're ready to hear the truth. And that always rubbed me the wrong way. There's various reasons to think that maybe that's the case. Maybe they wanted to figure out for themselves what was going on. Maybe they wanted to militarize these technologies. I don't know. But they took the lead on it. They left us in the dark, and I'm not cool with that. I mean, we can pretty much prove that there was a...
Loosen up, big brother.
Yeah, we can pretty much
I want to see them aliens.
I want to see them aliens. That there was a government cover-up. There's no doubt about that.
I can't help but just already hear the new Club Bryce track that's playing with those quotes in it. Bryce versus Big Brother. All right, well, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
The legend of Roswell is essentially oral history. That's because very few written records of what exactly crash landed in the New Mexican desert in July of 1947 exist. What we have mostly is a newspaper story from the Roswell Daily Record from Tuesday, July 8th, 1947, claiming that the Roswell Army Air Force recovered a crashed flying saucer. A newspaper story that redacted that story by a man named General Ronald Ramey on Wednesday, July 9th, who explained the UFO was actually a wrecked weather balloon. A few more official explanations were released by the U.S. government over the years involving a secret balloon project and a few dummies. A handful of memos were turned up by ufologists digging through the past. But if photos of the downed craft exist, we don't have them. If pictures of the alleged alien bodies also discovered in the wreckage exist, they have not been leaked to the public, despite numerous hoaxes that have turned up over the years. Check out our episode on the Roswell slides over on the other side for more info. All we really have is a story that was passed down by eyewitnesses, most of whom are all now dead, to their families, their close friends, and investigators. Many witnesses were career military men who remained silent for decades out of sworn duty, and some were civilians who allegedly kept quiet out of fear of retaliation against themselves or their families by our government if they spoke about what they saw.
Yeah, and we will prove that there was retaliation taken against these witnesses. I don't know if we can
prove anything.
We will hands down prove that on today's episode.
I don't know if we want to pick a fight with the military. This is all alleged, remember. Again, we don't have any proof, and we have to remain sort of open-minded to both sides. But
sure.
What we have left is a legend that lay dormant for almost 3 decades before exploding back into the public imagination in the late 1970s and inspiring a generation of UFO lovers, conspiracy theorists, and Hollywood filmmakers to ponder the phrase, "The truth is out there."
Yeah, it's given us so much, man.
The Roswell incident marks a fork in the road of space-time. Two realities emerged from that small desert town back in the summer of 47. The first reality is the one that we are living in today, the one that men like General Ronald Ramey wanted us to live in. The other reality is that the proof of extraterrestrial life fell from the stars and landed in the pasture of the Roberts Ranch, and the U.S. government covered it up, keeping the biggest discovery of human history and the alien technology that came with it secret from the world. In this multi-part series, we're going to get to know some of those witnesses and key players. We'll jump around in the timeline, work through the contradictions and inconsistencies to the story, of which there are many, but we'll also highlight the plausibility that something from another world did indeed crash in New Mexico shortly after the conclusion of World War II and the creation of the atom bomb. So, join us as we go down the rabbit hole for one of the most anticipated stories of high strangeness, the Roswell Incident. Roswell Part 1, The Cowboy Who Caught a Falling Star.
Love that.
The 2 weeks leading up to the mysterious crash saw the birth of the flying saucer craze in the U.S. On June 24th of that year, just a mere 2 weeks before the excitement at Roswell, flying businessman Kenneth Arnold spotted 9 boomerang-shaped crafts flying in formation over Mount Rainier in Washington while piloting his plane on his way to a sales meeting. Arnold described the crafts moving similar to that of saucers skipping across water, and the newspapers turned that phrase into flying saucer. We covered this story with Jen Kirkman last year, or it's been a while, but you can go back and get all the information on that. But I just love that this all started with a salesman who knew how to fly his own plane.
Yeah, no, it's great. And like so many great names like Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster, it's always coined by some random reporter who just took the terms that Arnold was using to describe these vehicles and turned it into flying saucers, which is now just a part of everyone's lexicon.
Yeah, and it's weird. You get a sense reading up on all this stuff that, like, just in those 2 weeks alone, this meme, exploded, and people were talking all about this. Fighter pilots had seen Foo Fighters in World War II. There were reports from Europe, I think in Germany and Sweden, of objects that they refer to as ghost rockets.
Yeah.
And people were just seeing this shit, and it got really popular. Ray Palmer, I'm reading a book on Ray Palmer right now, who was the editor of Fate magazine, and he kind of took the flying saucer thing and ran with it. He covered a story, that Maury Island UFO story about the people who were fishermen who claimed that these donut-shaped UFOs dropped all this weird metal on them on a beach. It's the first Men in Black encounter story. All this stuff is happening. Now, that story, there's a lot of people who say that story's a hoax, but my point is that the mythology of the UFO and the flying saucer is all being born in this 2 week time period, and it has everything in it that we still, Men in Black, flying saucers, strange alien beings, all of it is happening in this little window of time.
I think it's a really they're here moment for the United States. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's bizarre. So Roswell in 1947, it was a small town. It's composed of dairy farms and ranches stretching for hundreds of miles in the surrounding New Mexican wilderness. It was a western town full of farmers and cowboys, and the other main industry was the Army, because Roswell was home to the Roswell Army Airfield.
Yeah, that's right. This was before the Air Force was its own separate branch. So all these, the Roswell Army Airfield was part of the Army, where it held all sorts of. Oh my God! But planes for there was no Air Force, is what I'm saying. The Air Force didn't come till after this.
Yeah, and in fact, the Air Force was started in I believe December of 1947, right. Like 6 months after this, which kind of makes me wonder if one of the reasons the Air Force became its own thing was because they made the discovery that there are objects not of this earth flying around in our airspace.
I mean, there's a good case to be made for that. Absolutely.
So talk about the 509th, Bryce.
Yeah, so just to give you a little of idea about this Roswell Army airfield and the people who worked there, I'm going to read from Witness to Roswell by Thomas Carey and Donald Schmitt. The state of New Mexico in 1947 was the most sensitive and highly guarded area in our country, if not the entire world. Not only was there ongoing atomic research at Los Alamos, where the first atomic bomb was developed, but there was also the testing of captured German V-2 rockets taking place just to the south at White Sands near Alamogordo. Not far from Alamogordo was the Trinity site. The world's first atomic bomb was detonated, and at Roswell itself, which was the headquarters of the 509th Bomb Group, the only atomic strike force in the world at that time. It was the 509th that just 2 years earlier had dropped the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. Little did they know that they would also become involved in one of the most significant and historic events of all time, the crash of an unknown object from another world. So this isn't just some podunk army base. I mean, this is the world's top secret, highly classified bases in the world.
Hey, man, I'm sorry. Listen, we don't have any ammunition. We don't have a lot going on here. We're just a podunk army base. You want to head down to the RAAF in Roswell. They'll get you situated.
Nice nukes over there, big ones.
They got them big bombs.
I mean, it just
got them V2s. That is really, really interesting, though. I didn't know that connection.
You know, and more than that, Riley, this is really going to start to speak to the convenience of where this object crashed and the materials that people reported seeing the crash. There's so many correlations and conveniences. It makes for just such a strange case.
Well, it's just so wild. I mean, if you're somebody who's getting super, jazzed up about conspiracies and UFOs and aliens, like, it's really hard to ignore the 1+1 of you have atomic bombs being tested and then you have a crashed UFO. Like, there's even theories that have, I've heard for years that, dropping the nukes out in New Mexico ripped a hole in space-time, and these crafts came out of that wormhole. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And that there are these, really, this is like really out there theories that, those bombs are so powerful that, they're not just felt in this dimension, they're felt in all of our neighboring dimensions as well.
Yeah.
So
well, if that's the case, we've ripped a lot of holes because they've blown up a lot of those bombs.
I know. And it's think about that. I mean, think about maybe that's just like punching so many holes in our reality to let creatures in. I mean, it's a very Stephen King idea.
It is.
Here's another crazy idea, and we'll theorize as we go along this, these multiple episodes. But I've as to what these beings were. But sometimes it's often been postulated that this could be us from our future. And so many times in alien contactee experiences, you hear about atomic annihilation, and you were like, I often think that, like, if we were in the future, where's the one time and place we would want to go back to fix things if something completely awful happened in our future, say nuclear annihilation? We would want to come back to here where they developed the bomb.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. The other thing I wanted to note about the Army or the RAAF base was that in World War II, they kept German prisoners of war at the base.
That's great. I didn't know that.
Because this area is just surrounded by, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of miles in that desert of just, ranches and farms. There's nothing. It's just a desert out there. So they kept German soldiers there because if they tried to get out and escape, there was nowhere to run to.
It's the Alcatraz of the desert, man.
Yep, it totally was. And they had German soldiers help build some of the infrastructure, German prisoners, I should say, infrastructure in Roswell. They dug a canal that runs through the town near the base. And these guys, they secretly built a German iron cross and buried it in the canal. That years later, when the city was digging up the canal and rerouting stuff, they found that these guys had built this. They marked it with a giant iron cross.
That's insane.
As sort of a fuck you to the U.S. Isn't that crazy?
Wow, I had no idea. That's wild.
So then again, you also have this like weird, just like Nazi history in Roswell as well. You know what I mean? Like it is a crossroads for all the weird and dark side of ufology. And you know, it's a very interesting place for being, you know, quote unquote, middle of nowhere.
Wow.
So what many of our listeners may not know is that the Roswell crash didn't actually happen in Roswell, but 75 miles northwest of the city in Corona, New Mexico, which was basically just a one-horse town out in rancher territory. In the days leading up to the Roswell incident, people were seeing strange objects in the night skies. Bryce, you want to talk about a couple of the eyewitnesses that saw something in early July?
Yeah, absolutely. I at first I would just be remiss if I didn't mention what a strange synchronicity that happened in Corona, and we're experiencing the coronavirus right now. Crazy.
This is the problem. You get into this and you start seeing everything. You know what I mean? Like you start seeing.
We are connected.
Yeah. This is why
it's all coming together.
This is why, like last week, I was like, take a break, Michael.
So yeah, well, here's something probably a lot of people may not realize, but people did see UFOs just days before the Roswell crash. Don Wilmot and his wife ran a hardware store right in town, and they witnessed what they thought were two wash bowls on top of one another. Just outside of Highway 285, and that was on July 2nd.
Not literal wash bowls, because the way you said it made it sound like they saw flying dishware.
Right. Well, that's how they described it, right? So it's that typical flying saucer shape of two dinner plates, one on top of another.
I think they call it mouths touching, which is such a weird phrase.
Well, and William Woody and his father saw a fiery object descending toward Earth. Now, a day or two later, they went to see if they could find where it landed, and this was also on July 2nd, the same date that Don
Thursday,
and his
July
wife.
3rd. It was on the 3rd they saw it.
Okay, gotcha.
Don saw it. And listen, this timeline is going to get crazy, guys. Bryce and I are going to be checking each other a lot. But essentially, all you need to know is that most of what happens takes place the very first week of July of 1947. Basically, these events run from July 1st through the 4th of July weekend and then into the middle of the next week. So we're talking like the 1st through the 9th of July is basically when all of this takes place.
Yeah, that's right. And they said that they had went out a day or two later to see if they could find where whatever this thing was landed, and that they ran into a military cordon, which was a cordoned off area. And I was like, oh, that doesn't add up, because if they saw this thing on the 3rd, that means they would have ran into a military cordon on the 5th, and the military didn't get there until the 8th. So already I was like, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, but I think also, too, with these witnesses, and again, this is the problem with, like, this goes back to the Stanton Friedman comment, like, you know, they're talking about this stuff with investigators decades after the fact.
Yeah, true that.
So they, you know, when they go a couple days later, they might mean 5 or 6 days or a week later.
I'll give you that, sure.
We don't know, and that's, again, part of the problem with getting into all this stuff is you're also battling memories, and a lot of times people will contradict themselves. But I think the important thing is that there were, people did see stuff leading up to the crash.
Most
flying
definitely.
around New Mexico. So according to the story, on the night of July 3rd, there was also a big storm, an electrical storm, typical for Roswell's monsoon season. Cowboy and foreman Mac Brazel was hanging out in his modest cabin on the Roberts Ranch in Corona when he thought he heard a large crash. So there's a theory that whatever fell that night was struck by lightning and caused the craft to careen. Thank you. Out of control. And basically what it does, we're going to find out that there's not just one crash site. There's 2 and maybe or 3. And what they think happened is this craft came, struck by lightning, came down in the ranch, dug a huge trench, scattered a bunch of debris, and then went back up into the air, flew for a couple more miles before crashing into the side of a hill.
Yeah.
So it's basically like in Lost. If you ever watched Lost, how there was like 2 sections of the plane. There was the cabin and then the tail. So this thing strikes, breaks off a big part of the craft as it wobbles down. That crashes, and then the rest of the craft crashes like 2 or 3 miles away, maybe even further than that.
Well,
I have to double check now.
To help visually, think of it like that. This thing hits the ground, the tail completely, or half of the saucer completely comes off, goes back into the air, bodies start falling out, and it finally lands somewhere about 40 miles north of the crash site, disc and all.
40?
Yeah, I think it was 40.
40 miles.
And it bounced 40 miles?
Yeah, so they posit that there was possibly 2 locations where bodies were deposited, not just one. So
one was 2 miles from the debris field, which we'll get into, and then the other where they said the cockpit of the craft crashed 40 miles away.
Right.
All right.
Also, side note, Mac Brazel is a great cowboy name.
Oh, dude.
Yeah.
Come
on.
So good. Mac Brazel.
Yeah, Mac Brazel is this old school cowboy. He really is exactly like how you think about him, Riley. He's living out on this ranch by himself. It's not his. He's just a hired hand, basically. He's tending sheep out there. And he's living in this tiny little cabin called the Hines House. It has no electricity, no running water. He's basically living in like the past century. Like he might as well have been living in the 1840s.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
We're talking about a salt of the earth guy, Yeah,
and that's also what's so cool about this story is it's almost kind of like has a little bit of a biblical kind of nature to it, where like a shepherd finds this thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I like that.
And you have like you have like future tech meeting old school cowboy tech.
Well, he was a shepherd. He was a shepherd. I mean, most of what they do on ranches out there in that area is herd sheep and produce sheep. So yeah, that makes sense. That's a great. I like looking at it like that.
So the next day, on the 4th of July, while doing ranch work, Brazel and 7-year-old Dee Proctor, who was the son of another rancher family that lived nearby, friends of Brazel's, they allegedly came across a giant debris field that was 300 yards wide and about a mile long. So this thing is huge. Now, I want to take note of that when later we're going to hear that this is a crashed weather balloon. 300 yards wide and a mile long. So that's like 3 football fields wide.
Yeah.
So that's that part where we said part of the craft came down and skidded across before it bounced back up into the sky, just letting all this debris everywhere. Now, this stuff that they find, Bryce, let's talk about this. What's the debris like?
Yeah, so a lot of people described this material as, they described multiple materials, but the one that stuck out mostly in people's minds were these very thin, like, pieces of what looked like aluminum. They often described it as like the top of a cigarette pack that you could easily manipulate and crumple in your hand, but as soon as you opened up your hand, it would go back to its original shape. They called it memory metal, and it was strong as all get out, right? We'll talk more about it later, about how people tried to cut this stuff, burn it, tear it, couldn't do it. It was extremely malleable, and yet it was extremely strong.
Yeah, so Brazel's just standing out there with this kid, and they're like wadding it up and tossing it in the air and then watching it float down like a leaf. There's like all this weird shit, and they're like, they've never seen anything like it. Dee's mother described it because what they do is then they take this stuff over to the Proctor's house, and he shows Dee's mom and dad, and they're looking at it, and later she went on to say it was almost like plastic, but they didn't have that type of plastic back then. So they really couldn't wrap their minds around what this was and then what it was made of. Brazel also found an I-beam
Yes, let's talk about these I-beams, yeah.
So there's supposedly these I-beams that when they were looking at them, they had printing along the center of it that ran up and down the I-beam that looked like writing of some kind. They called them hieroglyphics without the animals in it.
Right.
So they didn't know what this language was. They didn't know if it was some type of code. They couldn't recognize these strange symbols. And Brazel's not the only one who saw the I-beam. Well, that's sort of a prop that carries through the story.
Well, and the government would say that it was Scotch tape with flowers on it.
Right.
Which is interesting. But, here's where I want to start talking about some of these conveniences, right? First of all, the material that they're finding that's supposed to be extraterrestrial is thin, looks like aluminum, and very light. But yet that's the same material as these radar targets, right? We're talking about basically aluminum here. How convenient is that, right? And then the I-beams as well. People are seeing I-beams that they describe with strange hieroglyphics. Well, you know what else it took to make some of those radar targets on stuff like Project Mogul was balsa wood I-beams.
So by radar targets, you're talking about weather balloons,
I'm
basically.
talking about weather balloons that would go up into the sky, and attached to these weather balloons down below were these sort of triangular shaped, geometric shaped targets, for lack of a better word, that were equipped with aluminum so that they would bing off radars. I just always found it God, that's so strange that people would be that the material that takes to make an extraterrestrial craft looks and sort of seems like the same material of these radar weather targets. It's so strange.
Well, and the thing that we have to remember, too, is that with the airfield out in Roswell, ranchers were seeing weather balloons and finding them on their properties all the time.
Absolutely.
Mac Brazel would sometimes find this stuff, collect it, and then bring it into town and resell it to the army, because this dude was a poor motherfucker. This guy was scrapping and saving. So if they found stuff that belonged to the army on the ranch, oftentimes these guys would take it into town and sell it for cheap, but sell it for drinking money. And so they know what weather balloons look like. And also we need to mention weather balloons were not top secret back in the 1940s. People knew that these things existed.
I think one thing every witness can agree on, and here's another misconception. There were hundreds of witnesses, but they will all agree that this was no weather balloon.
Right, so word quickly started spreading around the ranching community that something strange had crashed in Corona the previous night. Up to 75 people supposedly wandered the area collecting debris. And according to authors and Roswell investigators Tom Carey and Donald R. Schmitt, who wrote the book Witness to Roswell, that was a big part of research for us, there was some memory metal even passed around a 4th of July rodeo.
Right.
This is all before the authorities were ever informed that something out of this world had happened. Bryce, why don't you talk about the bar? This is one of my favorite parts of Mac Brazel's story.
Yeah, right. So Mac has in his hands the strangest material, and he's fascinated by it. And he's showing it to neighbors. Hey, what do you think this is? He's giving pieces away. Finally, totally frustrated, he goes to a bar in town called Wade's Bar, where he starts passing it around patrons. And, everybody's drinking and they're all just sort of trying to burn it, trying to cut it, So it's everybody in this bar is like, man, I don't know what that is. Here, pass me a piece. So it's just they're drinking and toying around with basically space parts. It's fucking great just to think of it in my mind,
Yeah, and I think it was someone at Wade's Bar who said, hey, maybe this is part of one of those flying saucers we keep hearing about. Maybe there's a flying saucer that crashed on the ranch.
That's right.
And this patron had heard on the radio that there was some national station that was offering up to $3,000 for proof of flying saucers. Because remember, this is the hot thing at the time. So Brazel thinks about that, and he goes back to the debris field on the 5th with Dee and his another neighbor kid, Sidney Jack Wright, possibly others. Okay, so this is when there's some holes in the story that we're trying to put together, but This might have been the day when Brazel and company stumbled across something else about 2.5 miles from the scattered debris field, and that was an alien body. We get this from Jack Sidney Wright, who told Schmitt and Carey that there were bodies, quote unquote, there were bodies, small bodies with big heads and eyes, and Mac was there too. We couldn't get away from there fast enough. So allegedly, D, Mac, and at least this one other kid saw these bodies. Now, this isn't the main crash. This isn't where the cockpit of the saucer was. This is just a few miles away. Yeah. But the big problem, from all accounts, was that Brazel finally got fed up with this debris because the sheep would not come near it, and he couldn't get the sheep to cross the field. So, coupled with that problem, and coupled with this idea that maybe there would be a big reward for this stuff, he loads up his beat-up old pickup truck with some of the materials and drove 75 miles down into Roswell to speak with Sheriff George Wilcox. And while Brazel was talking to the sheriff, it just so happened that local radio KGFL DJ, a man named Frank Joyce, called looking for any news of the day. You know, the radio station would call and say, hey, have you made any arrests? Have you done anything? You know, it's a small, sleepy kind of town. Not a lot of stuff happens. So the sheriff, now there's two versions of this, and the book contradicts itself. At one point, the sheriff is bored with Mac's story, and then in another version of the story, the sheriff is very intrigued. Either way, the sheriff hands the phone over to Mac Brazel and goes, here, why don't you tell Frank Joyce what you found in your field?
Right.
So
it was his day off, and he actually lived right above the jail cell. So him and his family were eating dinner. So he's like, yeah, that's nice, fancy. I ain't got time for that. My steak's getting cold.
It was Sunday.
Your space tech.
Tell the radio man.
It was Sunday, so he was annoyed. It was Sunday on a holiday weekend, so he was annoyed that this rancher's coming down with this metal, complaining that somebody needs to go up there and clean up the debris. So anyway, Brazel talks to Frank Joyce, and we're going to read from this book. This is Frank Joyce recalling how the conversation went. And Bryce, why don't you play Mac Brazel, and I'm going to play Joyce.
Who's going to clean all that stuff up? That's what I want to know. I need someone out there to clean it up.
What stuff? What are you talking about?
I don't know. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's from one of them flying saucer things.
Really? Well, then you should call the air base. They are responsible for everything that flies in the air. They should be able to help you or tell you what it is.
God, what am I going to do? It's horrible. I mean, horrible. Just
what's
horrible.
Wait, what's horrible? What are you talking about?
The stench. It's just awful.
Stench from what? What are you talking about?
They're dead.
What? Who's dead?
Little people. Unfortunate little creatures.
Wait, this is crazy. What the? Where? Where did you find them?
Someplace else.
Well, you know, the military's always firing rockets and experimenting with monkeys and things, so...
God damn it, they're not monkeys.
Maybe it was...
And they're not human.
So Joyce recommended that Brazel take the materials to Roswell Army Airfield and speak with the head of the base, Colonel William Blanchard.
Now, I just want to say, think about how just what Mac wanted to do was get his sheep to water, right? And he was saying that his sheep would not cross that debris field. If this is just some, weather balloon like the Army said it was, I'm pretty sure the sheep wouldn't have a hard time getting to water. But something about this material that laid bare on his land, the sheep would not go near it. And of course, this is what motivated him to be like, somebody's got to get this shit off my property.
Right. So he goes to William Blanchard at the airfield, and Blanchard's plays a pretty big role in this story. He's the commanding officer of the base. He would go on, Riley, to become a 4-star general. and he actually died from a heart attack sitting at his desk in the Pentagon in 1966. Like, this guy was serious military, and at this time, he was the highest ranking officer on the base, but he also answered to General Ron Ramey, who was stationed in Fort Worth, Texas. So that's the guy who's commanding him while he has command of the entire base. So Blanchard assigns head intelligence officer Jesse Marcel Sr. and counterintelligence officer Sheridan Cavett to go up to the Foster Ranch with Brazel and collect the remaining debris. Now, these guys are the ones who get the job because Jesse Marcel, as head intelligence officer, if there was ever a plane or anything that ever wrecked, he would be one of the guys going out there to investigate and find out what happened, what went wrong, right? Anything
Just
that
think
involved
about that
any
for a
type of
second.
level of intelligence at the base.
He's the head of intelligence at the 509th Atomic Strike Force. So just think about how much, his upper superiors trusted this guy, and, obviously competent. It does not speak highly enough of this guy's capabilities,
Right, sure.
And Sheridan Cavett was head of counterintelligence. So this is a guy, if there is a foreign investigation or a foreign threat, he's going to be involved. So he's sent up there because if this isn't one of ours, if this is something that, say, the Russians were flying over New Mexico, then he'd need to take a look at it as well, right? So they go up there. Meanwhile, word is already spreading around town that a flying saucer had crashed north of Roswell. There's stories of young guys getting on their motorcycles and driving up to the ranch to look for stuff.
Children on horseback, everybody. It seemed like the whole town knew about this crash before the authorities did.
Because it's a small town. Word spreads really, really quickly. So Marcel and Cavett go up, they spend the night in the Hines house with Mac Brazel eating cold beans, and which would just suck. I mean, if you had to go up there and just be like, God damn it, it's Sunday night, and now I have to go sleep in a cabin in the desert that has no electricity. Both of these guys are both family men. It's like, I gotta go drag my ass up here with this old cowboy. So they go up there, and at daylight, so now we're on Monday, July 7th.
Yeah, but you have to remember, Michael, that Mac Brazel brought in samples to the Roswell Army.
I know.
These guys were obviously had held this stuff in their hand, and Mac's saying, there's a whole shit ton of it. You guys need to come get it. Take a look and see what's... So they're probably immediately thinking, in the backs of their minds, something fucking crashed out on that field.
No, I know. It's just I like the idea of having to go sleep in a tiny little it's like the mundane elements of this story are really appealing to me.
Totally.
So they wake up first thing in the morning, they go out to the debris field, and Cavett returned to the base midday with some of the materials. And more Army personnel were called up by the end of the day, and there was still allegedly a football field-sized area covered in debris on Monday night. So they send people back up there, and there are soldiers just walking in lines, shoulder to shoulder, marching through the desert and just picking up any piece of metal or any object that doesn't look organic or doesn't look like it belongs in the desert.
Yeah, Marcel and Cavett filled 2 vehicles, 2 trucks full of this stuff. Now, if this is just some weather balloon with a target, you could fit that in the back of your trunk of a Buick. You know what I mean? But yet to fill 2 full fucking cars, and just to speak on who Jesse Marcel was, he was a major. He received a diploma in 1945 from the Army Air Force's Training Command in what? Radar technology at Langley, Virginia. So he was highly trained in radar tracking materials and equipment, including Raywind targets and ML-307 reflectors, which were the dominant parts of Project Mogul balloon devices. So just to say that this guy, and we'll get into later what happens to Marcel, doesn't know what the fuck he's looking at is ludicrous and beyond reproach.
Yeah, so Project Mogul, for those wondering, that's what later the Army would come out and say, all of this was a weather balloon from a secret project that we were calling Project Mogul, and we were sending up these weather balloons high into the atmosphere and the goal was to detect whether or not Russia was blowing up nukes with these sensors. They were trying to literally listen for Russian nukes being tested.
Right.
So when we talk about Project Mogul, that's what they would later come out and say was behind all of this. But here's the thing. The project was top secret, but weather balloons were not, right?
Yep.
So they didn't have to make a big deal out of it. They could have just said, it's just a weather balloon, don't worry about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It didn't have to, it wouldn't require this type of response.
Well, and I think I should add here, it was the station at Roswell Army Airfield where they did launch weather balloon projects. So it's not like the people on the base weren't familiar with these things going up in the air. I imagine probably a lot of the soldiers would like to see these things take off from the airfield. You know what I mean? They're probably cool to watch. But the point is they launched weather balloons all the time.
Yes. Right. That's what we were saying. That's why ranchers knew how to recognize them. So anyway, at some point on Monday, KGFL owner, that's a radio station owner, Walt Whitmore, who wanted to go public with the Brazel flying saucer story, sent for Brazel up in Corona and brought him down to his house for a private recorded interview.
Yeah, you got to think this is the scoop of the lifetime.
The station had already signed off for the day, so they would broadcast the interview the next day. So not only was Whitmore being an intrepid reporter after a scoop, maybe the biggest scoop of all time, like Bryce said, he had a feeling that with all the buzz surrounding this mysterious UFO crash, Brazel was about to become a hot commodity. So keeping him at his house was also a way of keeping him safe. On the morning of Tuesday, July 8th, Whitmore sat down with co-owner of KGFL, George Judd Roberts, and they interviewed Brazel about his findings on Foster Ranch. They recorded a full interview about this stuff, and we never got it. We've never been able to hear this because of what happened next. The order of events that happened are a little unclear, but shortly after that interview, Roberts received a call at KGFL from a man named TJ Slowey. And I know we're throwing a lot of names at you guys, but bear with us. TJ Slowey, he was the executive secretary of the FCC, and he told Roberts not to air the interview due to national security issues. Mm-hmm. If they did, KGFL would lose their license. As Roberts' head started spinning, he received another phone call from U.S. Senator of New Mexico, Dennis Chavez, who urged Roberts to follow orders. Roberts pleaded for help in changing the FCC's mind on the matter, but Chavez simply told Roberts the situation was out of his hands. So by Tuesday morning, Washington is aware of what's happening, right? And the
quick question on that.
Yeah.
Wait, real quick. When was the War of the Worlds broadcast?
Back in the 30s. That's like early 30s. But that's a really good question, because that's sort of in the back of people's minds, I think, in terms of like why they would want to, maybe one of the reasons they'd want to cover something up.
Absolutely.
Because
they're like, do we want this broadcast? The FCC's coming in like, you're going to spread panic.
Yeah,
we just
like people
wrapped up World War
died.
II.
People died because panicked and drove their cars off the road and died.
Know, for those who aren't familiar with what Riley's talking about, he's talking about in the 30s, Orson Welles did a play, a radio play of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and it was so realistic that it caused a nationwide panic.
Yeah, it was like one of the first meta pieces of art, because they just, even though they said that this is fictional, they aired it as if it was a real-time radio news report.
People stopped what they were doing and they all listened into their radios, and a panic ensued. Some people even committed suicide. That's how serious
people died.
Took that. And it was a forerunner. It gave the government an idea just exactly how would the public react if they got information of otherworldly visitors. So that's a great point, Riley.
Yeah, War of the Worlds was broadcast on October 30th, 1938, so less than 10 years before this. So everyone, that's a pretty recent memory, all things considered, for the men and women involved in this story.
Right.
So Dennis Chavez, the senator's like, no, dude, this I can't help you out here. You got to listen to the FCC. Do not broadcast this. So a sister station, KSWS in Roswell, this guy John McBoyle, he's general manager and part owner of that station. He heard about this story. He knew that KGFL was going to drop this. He calls KOAT in Albuquerque to transmit the Associated Press wire service, and he calls this woman Lydia Sleppy, who was the secretary at the Albuquerque station, and he says, Lydia, get ready for a scoop. We want to get this on the wire right away. Listen to this. A flying saucer has crashed. No, I'm not joking. It crashed near Roswell. So Sleppy urgently asked program director and acting station manager Carl Lamberts to witness her reception of the story and its transmission. Using the teletype, Sleppy alerted ABC News headquarters in Hollywood to expect a high bulletin story. Lamberts looked on as she initiated the connection. It's a big crumpled dishpan, Boyle, hardly containing himself, continued over the phone. And get this, they're saying something about little men being on board.
That's right, but before Sleppy could type out just a couple of sentences, guess what came in? A teletype on the line went
beep, 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 beep. Attention, Albuquerque. Do not transmit. Repeat. Do not transmit this message. Stop communication immediately. National security matter.
So in stunned belief, she said, yeah, we're not running that.
Yeah, and she also checked in with McBoyle about it later, and he wouldn't talk about it anymore. According to the book, he says, forget about it. You never heard it. Look, you're not supposed to know. Don't talk about it anymore. So what we're seeing on Tuesday, July 8th, is the cover-up starting to happen. And all these events are really kind of overlapping themselves. And it all seems to be moving really rapidly at this point.
Yeah,
and
this is the clamp down.
Yeah, and so Mac Brazel's tracked down. Sheriff Wilcox finds him at the house of Whitmore, the station owner, and he tracks Brazel down, and Brazel is now suddenly taken into military for questioning at the base for the next 24 hours. And that afternoon, the Roswell Daily Record, which was the afternoon paper, this is back when newspapers had morning and afternoon editions. I remember that growing up in Kansas City.
Wow.
They ran the story, RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. And this story had been sent to them from the press secretary at the base, and a man named William Haut, H-O-A-W-T, who was told by Blanchard to let this story out. And we're going to get more into that in the next episode.
Well, just hold on. Let that just sink in for a second. Let that just sink in. Marcel and Captain Cabot
You're
were
really
sent
making
out.
us stop and think for a few seconds.
Well, hold on. But hold on. Marcel and Cabot brought material back to the base. Material that they would know right away was not some weather balloon, but from some foreign object, probably from space. Why? Because this memory metal was doing insane things that nobody on Earth had ever seen, giving Colonel Blanchard the idea to give out to his press secretary there at the base, put it over the air. We got a flying saucer. Imagine the pride he must have felt, you know? I mean, it's insane to think that he actually let that headline slip out to the press before going through the higher uppers.
And if he didn't, then we would never have this story. There would be rumors about it, and people would be talking about it, but it would not be the Roswell story that we know today, because the newspaper ran with the headline and the story that Mac Brazel had found a flying saucer up at the Foster Ranch.
That's exactly right.
Within hours of that, General Ron Ramey, the Blanchard's commanding officer from Fort Worth, would rewrite the story from a press conference in Fort Worth, claiming that the debris was simply that of a crashed weather balloon.
Well, plainly put, the shit hit the fan once that headline went out. The phone started ringing off the hook.
And Washington found out, and I'm sure it went up to Truman, and they were like, what the fuck are you guys doing? And again, this is, we go back to, there was no protocol for this. They're trying to work this out in real time. What do we do? And I have a theory that something changed, something quickly caused the cover-up. And my theory is that was the discovery of the bodies. I think once they found bodies, they went, oh, fuck. And they went, we have to zip this up. That's my speculation. I'm sure other people have that theory as well. Because what happened between July 7th and July 8th is if you were walking down Main Street around midday on Tuesday, you might have noticed a large truck called a lowboy hauling what appeared to be a large egg-shaped object covered in a tarp towards the military base. And that would be the cockpit. That would be the chunk of the ship where they had supposedly found the bodies in the third crash site. And that's not a place Mac Brazel ever went to. That was found by the Army when they were up there collecting the debris and flying over, and they find this thing. And there are other potential witnesses that also found that cockpit. We're not going to get into those today. We'll get into that on a future episode. But that's my theory, is that once they went, oh fuck, we have pilots, they went, shut it down.
Yeah. Yeah,
so
no doubt about it.
Brazel was released by the base, but was escorted by the military, who marched him into the Roswell Daily Record, where he was forced to recant his story. And the headline that ran the next day read, "Harassed rancher who located saucer, sorry he told it." And that's a fascinating headline to me, right? That feels really loaded. That almost feels like the reporter of that story is secretly writing what really happened, right? It doesn't say the thing was false or misidentified. The headline reads, "Harassed rancher who located saucer is sorry he told it," right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Well, talk about putting the fire out. He was literally escorted by security officers to the radio station, shoulder in hand.
Yeah, first to the newspaper and then to the radio station. But I want to focus on the newspaper story for a quick second before we go back to KGFL, Bryce. In this story, a couple things come up to me. In this story, he says that he found the wreckage on June 14th, which was almost a month earlier. And that's fascinating to me because this is where we get this conflicting timeline. We hear it happen on July 1st originally, but then in this recanted, in a different version of the story, Brazel says the 14th. So I wonder if that was the military asking him to put a little distance, and create this sort of new alternate timeline. I don't know,
It could even just be a typo, honestly.
It could be, or maybe this stuff was really up there for much longer than Carey and Schmitt have it in their own timeline. But he ends the interview, he ends the story with this quote, and this to me says it all. "I'm sure what I found was not any weather observation balloon. But if I find anything else besides a bomb, they're going to have a hard time getting me to say anything about it." So they also escorted him after that to KGFL. And Bryce, why don't you read this passage from the book? This is what he runs into. He comes in and he says, "Sorry, boys, I didn't find a flying saucer. What I found was a weather balloon." And Roberts, or was it Roberts, or was it
Joyce?
Joyce goes, Joyce chases him out after after he recants the story, and he goes, "Hey, that's not the story you told me before."
And Brazel feels awful. He basically says,
"They told me it would go hard on me if I didn't do what they said."
And so presumably Brazel had been warned of the dire consequences, not to the nation, but to Brazel and his family, if he said anything that conflicted with the Army Air Force's new official story. At that point, Joyce noticed the uniformed men standing just outside the glass door entrance. The reporter made one last attempt to get the truth. "What about the little green men you told me about the other day?" The rancher paused as he walked over to the door, put his hand on the doorknob. Turning towards Joyce, he casually said in a soft-spoken, matter-of-fact voice,
"They weren't green."
And out he went. And that concludes part 1 of Roswell.
Bum,
All right,
bum,
well
bum.
told, fellas.
It's a lot, man.
Next week, we're going to get into the Army's point of view and what happened with Marcel and Cavett and those guys after they recovered the debris from the field. And then we're going to tell the story about what happened to Marcel during the cover-up, which was basically sort of dumped on him.
Yeah, he was a fall guy.
Without his knowledge. He becomes the fall guy for this entire story. And that is a really fascinating aspect to this whole
and we need to
tale.
talk about the human aspect of the threats and the intimidation that the ranchers and their children received from Army personnel
Allegedly.
all over New Mexico. No. There were ranch wives that said these
I know,
people
buddy, but
came
we
in.
got to protect ourselves. We
Well,
can't slander the.
still, come
I'm
on.
saying it's according to their
Allegedly.
story.
Allegedly ripped up their floorboards, cut open their furniture, emptied their water tanks because they just knew that people had collected this metal.
Yeah,
and
apparently
it was stashed all over the town.
They went up to Corona, and all those cowboys and ranchers that were passing around this stuff, they managed to track everybody down and confiscate it and tell them to keep quiet and threaten people. Yeah, it's a really fascinating thing. And that little boy, D. Proctor, he never ever went on to talk about what he saw until he died. He never spoke to reporters. He never spoke to investigators. We only know about him being involved through that the other boy that had been up there. And it's kind of a sad thing. Like, apparently he was so freaked out by what he initially saw, which was maybe an alien body.
Yeah.
And then the military driving around and telling kids,
Shut the fuck up.
There was a story that a military man told one of the girls. He says, little girls go missing in the desert all the time.
That's right.
Oh, that's a nice thing to say.
And
Yeah.
there you get the idea that the kids and the children and the ranchers who saw, let's call them the bodies, were inadvertently affected for life. It's one thing to see some metallic debris and go, yeah, maybe that's ours. Maybe it's a top secret project. Maybe it's not ours. But that's not gonna haunt you. You know what I mean? People saw something lying on that desert floor, and you got to remember, this is a very sort of religious community. The way people contextualize their place in the universe changed in the matter of minutes upon seeing something that they just would not explain.
It's not also just bodies. It's bodies that have been sitting out in the desert rotting for at least like 3 or 4 days, if not since June, if we go by that timeline.
Yeah.
And the other big
Right.
thing an important note to make is that in 1947, right after World War II, Uncle Sam was super well respected. The people, the American public had lots of respect and trust for the government and the military.
Yeah.
So
We just liberated France. We just won a world war.
Yeah.
And thank God we're not all speaking German.
And apologies to our
Dankeschön.
German listeners. But so when the government said you don't talk, you didn't. It
Appealed to their patriotism,
Yeah,
their sense of national statehood, and that makes sense,
And to the public who weren't
does.
involved, if the government said it was a weather balloon, then it was a weather balloon. It wasn't, people went, okay, we trust you. Let's move on. And that's essentially what happened, was that everyone this story quickly died down, and the American public basically forgets about this for 30 years until Stanton Friedman finds a document that makes some mention of this and starts digging up the past and going over and talking to witnesses, and basically finds Jesse Marcel Sr. And Jesse Marcel Sr. in his old age, dying of lung cancer, basically starts spilling the beans. And that's what we're going to get into next week.
Look, this book is called, the book that we really kind of went over for the majority of our research is called Witness to Roswell. And it's called Witness to Roswell for a reason, because there is about 300 plus witnesses who were there at the time, who had family who heard about this. And I want to point out, the deathbed confession of some of these officers and security personnel and people who touched the material, saw the bodies, speaks volumes. People,
we're going to get into all of that stuff.
People want to go to their grave with a clear conscience, and that so speaks truth to me of what these people say they saw.
Before we move on, guys, can I ask a couple questions now?
Absolutely
that we've
not. No,
laid out this.
No.
no.
Do not
Everything
talk
is
about
there for you. That's the. Of course. What are you thinking?
Okay, so basically, the very well told, guys. Truly, that's you've really painted the picture here for me, and I think it seems very clear that the weather balloon cover story is a cover story. It's not. That's not true. But I wonder, like, was this just them experimenting with top secret weaponry and aircraft, and they crashed and or blew up?
It's a great
something
question.
Like maybe one of these V2 rockets, and then they set up this whole weather balloon cover story just to cover that?
Possibly, but Riley, what we're going to get into in the next episode or two is that you'll see that the government goes on for decades releasing. In the 90s, they went, okay, this is what really happened, and they mentioned Project Mogul. And then a few years later, or I think in the 70s, early 80s, and then years later in the 90s, they go, okay, that's not true. Here's what really happened. We were dumping these dummies out of like high altitude to see like if they would fall apart. Like they keep
what Michael's
re-explaining what it is over and over again, to the point where they become a completely unreliable narrator as well.
Yeah,
and the more they try to explain away the crash UFO stuff, the less sense it starts to make. Now, are they covering up some other type of top secret project? Sure,
like a long-range tactical nuclear missile.
Let me add this, though. There
are all sorts of theories that might explain this.
Riley,
but wait, let me finish my point. When you hear this stuff from Marcel's point of view and what happens to him, I think you'll understand why we're leaning into something that's more of an interdimensional or extraterrestrial.
Sure, right? Yeah. No, I mean, I want to go there. I'm just saying that from what I've heard, that's where my mind goes.
Okay, let's assume for a second that it was a top secret military project launched out of the 509th or somewhere else near there, okay?
Right.
Let's assume that it was a top secret military project and it went down. Why wasn't anyone looking for it? Why were ranchers and kids and everybody else looking at this stuff and playing with this stuff 4 days before anybody in the military actually thought about coming to look for it? You know, it doesn't.
That's an interesting point.
It doesn't make sense. You know, if this is a top secret project and it goes down, believe me, they know where it's going to go down and if it went down, and they're going to send out military personnel to pick this shit up before anybody else.
Sure. Okay. Interesting point. I'm intrigued. Interesting counterpoint.
All right, it's time for the next chapter in the Roswell Saga. Are you boys fucking ready for this shit?
Yeah, so ready.
Ugh. All right, guys, buckle in, because things are about to get bumpy over Corona, New Mexico. When we last left our story, it was early July of 1947 in Roswell, New Mexico. Mac Brazel, a foreman on the Foster Sheep Ranch in Corona, New Mexico, discovered a field of strange metallic debris over the 4th of July weekend and subsequently turned it over to the Roswell Army Airfield in Roswell, had just retracted his story that the wrecked parts came from an alien spacecraft at the behest of the military. Brazel's reaction was a surprise, considering it was the Roswell Army Airfield itself that sent out a press release the day before saying that they were in possession of a flying saucer. Now Mac Brazel was ordered to toe the new official line, that what he actually found were pieces of a weather balloon, even though the experienced rancher would have recognized one. Even more strange was the fact that Brazel had hinted to KGFL's Frank Joyce that he'd discovered dead alien bodies.
That's right. Now, in this chapter of our story on Roswell, we're going to take a look at the same course of events, but from the point of view of Major Jesse Marcel Sr., the 509th Bomb Squadron intelligence officer who was ordered by his base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, to report to the Foster Ranch in Corona and collect the debris for the Army. Marcel wouldn't know it at first, but this task would eventually set him up as the perfect fall guy for the Army's cover-up story.
Bigfoot Collectors Club presents Roswell Part 2, The Officer Who Touched Another World. After Brazel was escorted by military police into KGFL and the Roswell Daily Record to retract his story, the crashed flying saucer tale was dismissed and the country moved on. This, after all, was 1947, and trust in the American government was sky high after victory in World War II. So if Uncle Sam said something was a weather balloon, it was a goddamn weather.
Yeah, I don't know if our trust in the government is as high today as it was back then, but
Not quite, no.
Yeah, and it was what we failed to mention last week was that even though Brazel was not allowed to go home after retracting the story, he was taken back to base and he was held there for another 5 to 6 days. They basically kept him for the better part of a week, questioning him, going over the story. Who knows what? One of his son, Bryce, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, I mean, you're exactly right. You know, taken is a tame word. Abducted and detained would be more like it. I mean, talk about a violation of this man's civil rights. He was denied access to a phone. They gave him an Army physical, strip search, questioned and intimidated him for, think about that, 5 days for turning in something that fell on his ranch.
Yeah, and it was so sad, too, because in researching this, Riley, you find out that Brazel's family basically learned about all this in real time on the news. And I said real time again, so if you're playing a drinking game, that's the cue to take a sip. And one of the things that they were worried about was that no one was taking care of the animals up at the ranch. That was his job.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in fact, Mac's son, Paul, he was a Texas rancher. He immediately, after learning his father was detained, came to look after the animals and found that he couldn't get on the ranch. The military police literally kicked him off his father's ranch. You know, and he never mentioned much about the story of the Roswell crash, but on his deathbed, he told his nephew, Joe,
"You know, one thing that always riled me up even to this day is every time I tried to get to the main ranch house to water the horses in all that summer heat, the damn Army forced me off the ranch. I tried again the next day and they still threw me off the property. I was sure they did nothing for any of the animals."
And that's such a bummer. Yeah, it's a bummer note. But it's one of those things that really humanizes the story for me. It really kind of grounds it in reality. And you realize that, like, okay, crash UFO aside, like this search and this moment had an impact on people's lives and on the lives of the animals at this ranch. So it's those little kind of humanizing details that really make, obviously we know something fell, but it makes this all a little bit more believable.
More like
it shows the severity of it, you know, where they're willing to go to those lengths of just uprooting these people's lives. And, you know, that's I don't know.
I was going to say more of dehumanizing from the military than humanizing.
Well, yes.
Bastards.
Yeah.
Burn.
And in fact, I believe I might be wrong. I think it was Floyd Proctor, who was Brazel's neighbor, saw Brazel in town the day that he was being forced to retract his story. And he was talking about how he saw him escorted by MPs and Brazel wouldn't look him in the eye. And then not too long after this whole thing ended, Brazel bought a brand new pickup truck, and then he left Corona to go start his own business. Yeah. And there were rumors going around, and one of his other son, Bill, will deny this, that the Army may have even paid him off to keep quiet. And that was one of the reasons that he shut up, because Floyd Proctor's wife, and her first name escapes me, I apologize, she said that, you know, this is a guy who never had two nickels to rub together, and suddenly he's off starting his own business in a brand new truck.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's exactly how they ran it. Rough him up, pay him off, get him out of there.
Yeah, they made him an offer he couldn't refuse, you know? Yeah. Sounds like a mob bargain.
You're exactly right. That's exactly what it was, Riley, in a sense.
So the Roswell crash and Jesse Marcel Sr. emerged from the shadows of history 30 years after the events that took place in Roswell. In 1978, Stanton Friedman reignited interest in the phenomenon when he interviewed Marcel, who for the first time ever publicly made the claim that the whole weather balloon story was a cover-up, and that what he and many other officers from the RAAF witnessed back in that strange July of 1947 was from another world.
Yeah, I mean, this story was asleep until then, right? I mean, so what happened, Michael? He made a public statement. What does that mean?
Well, so we'll get into this towards the end of this chapter, but basically, Stanton Friedman came along, ufologist, UFO researcher,
R.I.P.
Imagine in the time that passes after Roswell, we go through Project Blue Book and J. Allen Hynek. We go through all the stuff with John Keel in the 60s, the Mothman prophecies. Now we're in the late 70s, and it's kind of what like John Tenney brought up in his recent episode, how this is a generational thing. The next generation comes along and they're looking at all this stuff and going, what's happening what really happened here? And through the Freedom of Information Act and some stuff being declassified, Friedman comes and some other researchers come along, find some memos and old documents that lead them to believe that Roswell's a cover-up. And he goes out to start to find some of these old-timers that were involved. Of course, one of the first guys he goes to is Jesse Marcel Sr., because he's the guy who we'll learn is the cover boy or the poster boy for this story. So Marcel is, at this point in the late 70s, he's got emphysema. Doesn't have long to live. And we'll get into this again, and you'll kind of see why he kept quiet, but he wanted to tell the story. And I think he waited until he was close to dying to say the story. Friedman interviewed him on camera. He went on In Search Of. So he started going public with his story in the last few years of his life.
Well, and one thing a lot of these witnesses had in common, speaking in their older ages and as to these deathbed confessions, so many of these guys were afraid of losing their pensions and being able to, care and support for their family. But, having known that their life was limited now and had a short window, they were like, I want to clear my conscience and I want to clear my good name and speak my truth. And who cares the ramifications,
Right, and there was witness intimidation involved, allegedly, and these guys were also, that was their job. This, Marcel was an intelligence officer. It was his job to keep intelligence top secret, if it was top secret.
Yeah.
So let's rewind, go back to Sunday, July 6, 1947, the day that Brazel brought a box of debris into Roswell to show Sheriff Wilcox. On the recommendation of radio DJ Frank Joyce, Brazel called the RAAF and Colonel William Blanchard, Jesse Marcel Sr., and CIC officer Sheridan Cavett came down to the sheriff's station to take a look at Brazel's discovery.
Yeah, Michael and I were talking about this too. So in the book that we focused on for our research, Witness to Roswell, it was kind of assumed that perhaps Mac had maybe, taken this box of debris to the RAAF himself, which I sort of was like, that's a little strange, right? To show up at the front gate of a top secret Army Air Force base and be like, yeah, I got this box of space junk. Can I talk to somebody who can help me out with this? And
hey, one of those ranch people are back. What do we want me to do with them?
But so I guess I think Michael and I agreed that probably what most likely happened is that Sheriff Wilcox had called the brass over at RAAF and said, hey, I got this feller here. He's got this stuff. You guys should come take a look at it,
Well, and that's what they say happened in UFO Crash at Roswell by Kevin Randle and Donald Schmitt, which is an older book than Witness to Roswell. And these books often contradict themselves and new information comes to light. So this is one of those that we're not sure, but last week, I think, we said he went to the base, but it seems that it's more likely they came to him at the sheriff's station.
Yeah, so let's assume that brass from the base came to the sheriff's office. Now, Mac probably used the words flying saucer when handing over some of this debris, and you have to imagine that the colonel of this base is looking it over, probably thinking, what on God's green earth is this stuff? Because that's how they talked back then. And having really no clue as to what this stuff is or where it could come from. Now remember, he was the colonel of a base that housed and deployed America's most top secret weapon, the atomic bomb.
I was going to say Spider-Man. But
right. And with
that would have been better. That would have worked out a lot better for everyone had it been Spider-Man.
Now, and with him are two of his most trusted intelligence officers. One, Major Jesse Marcel, and two, Captain Sheridan Cavett. And who better to get to the bottom of whatever this stuff was? Jesse was the head of intelligence at Roswell, probably to see if it was one of ours. And Captain Sheridan Cavett, who was part of the CIC, which was the Central Intelligence Corps. Now, this was before the CIA, to see if it was one of theirs, meaning the Russians.
And these guys, you have to keep in mind, Riley, that Blanchard, he's one of the guys who helped plan the nuclear attack on Japan.
Wow.
Like the 509th Bomb Squadron, these guys in Roswell, that these are all these three officers are currently working for and with, they're the bomb squadron that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah.
Like, so these guys were in the shit. They are like part of history, and it just blows my mind to think that if this was a flying saucer from another planet that crashed out there in Corona, that it fell into the hands of the guys who dropped the bomb in Japan.
Yeah.
That's a crazy connection. Crazy.
Fucking insane, right? So weird.
Yeah.
So whatever Blanchard thought of what he saw that Sunday afternoon, he was compelled to order Marcel and Cavett to follow Brazel back up to the ranch and collect more samples. The debris Brazel brought into the station was meanwhile locked up in evidence at the sheriff's station until it was later confiscated by Blanchard after they decided it was probably best kept at the base. So again, like Bryce said, Blanchard's primary concern at this point on the 6th is this is probably Russian and we need to get a hold of it.
Mm-hmm.
So Brazel, Marcel, and Cavett, they arrive at the ranch at dusk, and it was getting too dark to examine the debris field. So they crash in Brazel's tiny cabin for the night, eating those cold beans, chomping on some crackers. Brazel had carried a 3-foot-long slab, if we can even call it that, it was so thin, a piece of wreckage, back to his modest dwelling earlier that weekend. And with not much else to do, Marcel and Cavett tested the piece for radiation and found that there was none.
Not much else to do. Well, hey, we got nothing to do. Should we take a look at this thing?
Yeah, I mean,
that's why we're here.
You have to remember, no electricity, no phone line. They're just sitting in this little Heinz house, this tiny little cabin, twiddling their thumbs. But they've got a piece of UFO there. They might as well take a look at it.
I love that my intelligence officers are even country bumpkins. Well, we got this here flying saucer stuff. Let's test her for radiation.
It's a BCC staple. All of our witnesses are country bumpkins. So, unable to identify this strange metal, the officers tucked in for the night and waited to see what tomorrow would bring.
It's like Christmas.
Christmas for army men. Maybe we'll find an alien in our stocking this year. And this is another random point I'm just going to bring up for those of you who are hardcore Roswell researchers listening to this. In some of these stories, there was a third CIC officer, a subordinate of Cavett's with them. I can't find where he fits into the story or not. So for the sake of our story, we're just saying it's Marcel and Cavett with Brazel.
Yeah.
At any rate, at the crack of dawn on Monday, July 7th, Brazel led Marcel and Sheridan Cavett through the rough terrain of the ranch to the debris field he had discovered on July 4th. Or 3rd. Who knows? This timeline's so wild. Years later, Marcel would tell In Search Of that the debris field was so remote that they never would have found it had it not been for Brazel's guidance.
Right.
Again, just remember that this is out in the middle of fucking nowhere.
Yeah, apparently the wind was blowing pretty hard that day, and Marcel and Cavett could see flecks of the lightweight material fluttering in the breeze like ash. Now, Jesse Marcel described the metal, or what looked like metal, to be as thin as the foil wrapper in a cigarette pack. Think about that if you're a smoker, and if you are, please give me a cigarette. Most of the debris pieces were as tiny shattered glass, and because the mysterious metal didn't reflect the sun, which is an odd property, Marcel and Cavett could see that it would be a tedious task to collect everything.
Yep, and they saw what Brazel brought in, those long I-beams with the strange symbols on it, these metal-looking sheets that were as thin as newspaper but couldn't be bent.
I want to talk
that
about
foil-like
this.
metal that could
Yes.
be crumpled up and sometimes talked about looking almost liquid in your hand, but then would quickly reform to its like original state.
Yeah, you called it T2 material, Terminator 2, the T1000, T2000.
I mean, it's totally what it is, right?
No,
It's
totally.
Just,
but I want to talk about this for a second, and you know, I'm allowing for conjecture from both you guys. If this material that is, you know, paper thin as the foil on a cigarette pack, and it was from outer space, what could that material have been? Do you guys think that was part of the outer shell, or perhaps some of the interior, or you know, what do you guys think?
Yeah, maybe some kind of like heat shielding or something, like something to do with, you know, being in the atmosphere. At least that's what it sounds like compared to like the materials that we have that I would think of.
yeah, or like something in, you know, encasing the gravitational engine or whatever they're using to fly this craft around. But Bryce, this is the thing. I don't know if you've thought about this, but this is the thing that every time I get into this story, and not just researching it now, and I still haven't found a good answer, which is, if this UFO is made of indestructible materials, then how the fuck did it explode when struck by lightning? Like,
Totally.
how did it?
Yeah.
It's like the whole, you know, bad joke of like, why don't they build the plane out of black box material? It's like,
Yeah.
this
No,
I
you
don't.
you travel 1,000,000 miles and you're struck by lightning. Give me a fucking break.
But if these guys can't
is-
cut
yeah.
this shit, if they can't burn it, then how the fuck did it explode?
But it's often led me to think that perhaps this was an intended crash by the, let's call them the visitors. You know, maybe they wanted us to have these materials.
Maybe they wanted to die in that hot desert. I don't know.
Well, I
you-
don't know. Isn't it so convenient though that this happens right at the doorstep of the 509th, right at the age of right at the atomic age, and just right when their materials look something like a radar target and old weather balloon materials, and it's just there's so many strange conveniences and contradictions.
Well, okay, let's
Drives
talk
me
about
nuts.
this. Let's talk about that. You brought up this word convenient last week, and I've been thinking about it. What do you mean by convenient? Do you mean coincidental?
Coincidental, yeah, it's like,
you know,
like super coincidence. It does to me. I guess I have a problem that this memory metal is thin as cigarette foil. You know, the foil in a cigarette pack, and yet the same time, you know, these radar targets are made from like basically aluminum foil. It's like so convenient that these materials are pretty much exactly alike. Only one you can fold up and it throw it in the air and it, you know, goes back to its original form. It's just,
it's
I don't
wild,
know.
and it kind of goes into the one. The skeptic would say it's because it was the same material as the
Right,
radar stuff.
right, of course.
Doesn't explain why you couldn't burn, bend it, or whatever. But the other thing is, it kind of goes back to when we were reviewing Passport to Magonia on the other side. Like, perhaps it's one of those things where this interdimensional entity, the aliens,
Yes.
are looking at what we're putting up in the air and going, oh, okay, this is what they think flying stuff looks like. So why don't we form a craft that looks like their flying materials?
Now you're talking.
And we'll show up in that. You know what I mean? Because
Absolutely. I love this.
Because there's even stuff that they described finding in the field that looked like wood but wasn't wood, and these weather balloons had wooden, you know, I-beams on them.
No, now you're talking. So we so often say that, you know, this phenomenon uses the person's consciousness to sort of mimic an objective reality that they might be able to understand. Perhaps, you know, when whatever this craft was physically manifested, perhaps it too was mimicking something just outside of our technological capabilities.
Right,
something
because
that we would understand.
Right, and something that may not be threatening, because if they came as like a fucking, you know, German, you know, bomber,
right,
then that's very threatening. But if they come in the appearance of like, look, we're just made out of the things that kites are made out of,
Totally.
like, we're less likely to shoot it down.
Absolutely.
Despite the fact there are theories
theory.
that the Army was shooting these things down with radar guns, and that's like a whole other tangent that we're not
that's
going to
another
get
episode.
into.
We got to stay on course.
Oh my god!
Focus.
So Cavett and Marcel are looking around. They're realizing there's too much fucking debris to pick up here because remember, we're talking, 2 or 3 football fields wide and a mile long. But what did they do, Bryce?
They loaded up 2 vehicles worth of material, and around noon, Cavett drives back to Roswell, where he presumably shipped some of this stuff to his superiors in Washington, D.C. for examination. Now, you have to remember, Cavett was part of the Counterintelligence Corps, which predates the CIA. But he also reports to Blanchard the size of the debris field. And so, because of that afternoon, dozens of officers and MPs were sent to the ranch to assist with a cleanup. They had to cordon off the area, lock it down from prying eyes who had caught rumors of a crashed vessel from another world. Now, the Army would spend the next week collecting each and every tiny little sample they could find from the desert floor.
That's right. And you hear stories of these, the witnesses saying that in some of these old Army guys that they were lined up shoulder to shoulder in a line, just marching along the desert floor, sometimes on their hands and knees, just picking up what they were told, anything that doesn't look like it belongs.
Yeah, they were each given little burlap sacks, and they collected the debris, and they would all deposit it back into a wheelbarrow.
Now we've gone from Army Man Christmas to Army Man Halloween. Filling up their sacks with pieces of UFO.
Yeah.
Has any of this material leaked? Like, has any of it come out? Or
well,
that's
Riley,
a great question. Now,
that's a big question. We're going to get into that a little bit later in this episode.
Okay.
But here's the thing. The Brazel family would say that after the Army had cleared out, and again, remember that they not only went up to the ranch, but they also went around to all those rancher families,
that's right,
knocking on doors and confiscating any piece that they could find.
More than just knocking on doors, prying up floorboards, cutting through feed bags. I mean, they literally tore houses apart.
They tore families apart, God damn it. And there's always rumors, Riley, that some of this material had been kept secret and has been held in possession, but it's never truly turned up.
I mean, let's talk about it, Michael. Is this some of the material that maybe people are referring to nowadays in those New York Times articles? And
well, possibly. And we're going to get to that at the end of this episode. But anyway, so There's just a shit ton of this stuff, and by the end of that day, there was still a football field size left to collect. And also, we have to remember this is now on the 6th or the 7th. This is Monday, July 7th. At this point, Brazel's back down in Roswell talking to Walt Whitmore, the owner of KGFL, and he's about to be taken into military custody. So, as we also discussed in part 1. There were 3 crash sites, allegedly. The debris field, where we've been spending most of our time. A second possible site where a body or 2 had been ejected from the craft that was located about 2.5 miles from the debris field. And then the final resting place of the hull or the cockpit of the craft 30 to 40 miles away, which is where the rest of the alien bodies were supposed to have been found, sprawled across the rocky terrain.
Yep.
Now, who exactly was the first to discover the cockpit of the craft still remains a bit of a mystery as far as we can tell. In the original Unsolved Mysteries series, it was claimed that the main cabin of the saucer and 4 beings, one of whom was still alive, was stumbled upon by a man by the name of E.L. Barney Barnett, who is depicted looking a lot like Uncle Traveling Matt from Fraggle Rock, for our listeners who are old enough to remember him.
Okay, good.
Hiking in the desert with like one of those safari hats on and a backpack.
I can't stop imagining him as a puppet now.
he kind of, the actor who played him kind of looks like one. So the story of Barney Barnett, a civil engineer from Socorro, New Mexico.
Right.
Nice little synchronicity there. The Lonnie Zamora sighting took place in Socorro.
That's right.
Was included in the first major book on Roswell titled The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William L. Moore. And it basically goes like this.
G.L. Barney Barnett was wandering the plains of St. Augustine doing survey work on irrigation systems for the ranches when on Tuesday, July 8th, he stumbled upon a crashed saucer and 3 to 4 alien bodies. Shortly after Barnett's arrival on the scene, a group of archaeologists from a nearby college wandered up and they too saw the wreckage and bodies. According to Barnett, the bodies were small, skinny humanoid creatures with bald, pear-shaped heads and wore silver jumpsuits that had no buttons or zippers. Shortly after that, the army pulls up and a red-headed commander quickly closes down the site and bullies everyone into keeping their mouths shut.
So the timeline of Barnett's story and the location, the plains of St. Augustine, which is almost 140 miles away from Corona, they don't really add up. So we're going to take some artistic liberty here and say if Barnett and a bunch of college kids did find a crashed UFO in July of 1947, there's a pretty good chance it's not the one we're talking about.
What?
Instead, it's probably far more likely that the main section of the craft was discovered by the Army as it was doing flyovers of the ranch during the cleanup on Tuesday, July 8th.
Michael, are you postulating that there might have possibly been a separate alternate crash site?
I'm not postulating that. Stanton Friedman is postulating that. I started to go down a whole other rabbit hole with Barney Barnett.
Why.
There's some people who claim that 3 UFOs crashed that July out in the desert. That's like I started going down that route and I was like, you have to get back to Jesse Marcel. You have to turn around. Do not go down this rabbit hole.
But you know what? That vibes with a lot of like maybe of what I'm thinking, like perhaps if there was like, let's say 3 separate alternate crashes, then this was an intended event.
Maybe, or maybe our army was shooting down flying saucers and not telling anybody about it. Now, you know, and the other thing is like also that story of like a surveyor shows up just as you know at the same moment that like a group of college kids show up. There's no record of like archaeologists being out there, and Barnett's wife also kept a really good journal of their day-to-day lives, and they can't place Barnett in this location on that date. So it's all a little he said, she said. But there were people in the town from Roswell going up to the ranch to look for shit. But this seems a little too, as Bryce would say, a little too convenient for me. Now, we know that Marcel obviously saw the debris field. That's where he and Cavett are collecting all this stuff. But whether Marcel saw the second site, which supposedly had a couple bodies, also known as the D. Proctor body site, is anybody's guess. The Proctor body site was named after D. Proctor, the boy who accompanied Brazel when he discovered the wreckage on July 3rd or 4th, and who was allegedly so disturbed by what he saw that he never publicly spoke about it his entire life.
Yeah. And being so disturbed by what you saw, you have to assume that it wasn't just metallic debris, but actually alien bodies.
He mentioned something very cryptic to his mother, and that's about it. You know? And Bryce, I have to mention, you so vividly imagined this scenario of Mac and Dee stumbling upon the bodies in that original watercolor painting that entitled "Let's See Them Aliens."
Thank you so much, Michael. Available on our Instagram page at Bigfoot Collectors Club, and there's more paintings coming.
Excellent.
So there's no evidence that there's definitely no evidence that Marcel or Mac Brazel or Dee Proctor, for that matter, anybody from this crew ever made it as far as the third crash site where the supposed cockpit laid.
Right, but let's assume that they did see that second site where they saw the bodies. Now, although
I'm saying we can't assume. That's my whole point. We can't.
I want to say, let's assume.
Well, Bryce, Marcel never publicly mentioned seeing bodies.
No, that's right. Even his son, Jesse Marcel Jr., maintains that his father never spoke to him about bodies, but it would stand to reason that if Brazel had seen alien bodies at the second crash site, only a mere 2.5 miles from the debris field, he would have showed them to Marcel and Cavett. Perhaps both Marcel and his son, Jesse Jr., kept it a secret for their entire lives for reasons unknown.
So the only evidence for Marcel seeing bodies comes from extended family members.
Well, there you go.
A cousin. Well, yeah, but extended family. I have a few family members that like, they don't know anything about my life, and they never will. So there's a woman by the name of Sue Marcel Methane, and I'm not sure how she's related. I think she's a second or third cousin.
Okay.
And she told Tom Carey and Donald R. Schmitt when they were writing Witness to Roswell that Jesse had once told her at a family gathering that the aliens were white powdery figures. This is not long before he died in 1986. And then another cousin, Nelson Marcel, told the Huma Courier in 1998 that Jesse Sr. had seen, quote-unquote, pygmy bodies among the debris, possibly referring to the second crash site.
Well, there's two people describing it, and then you have what Mac told Frank Joyce. They weren't green. I don't know, sort of all checks out. Regardless, Marcel observed the cleanup of the debris until the wee hours of Tuesday, July 8th, after which he drove home to Roswell with a box of debris in his trunk. Now it was around 2 a.m. when he burst into his house, woke up his wife, V, and their son, Jesse Jr. Now,
his wife's name is V or Vi, probably Vi.
Viaud.
But her real name's Viaud. Her full name's Viaud, which is just like maybe he's married to an alien and he doesn't even know.
But this is that scene where I always could so vividly imagine it in my head where Jesse, comes in.
Because all I picture is you bursting through your door.
Well, basically, yes.
And waking up Don and the kids.
Yeah, everybody get up. Check out this shit. That's from a UFO right on your kitchen floor. And that's apparently exactly maybe what happened. Jesse gets out all the materials on the kitchen floor to show his family. He even gives his son a piece of this memory medal as a keepsake.
Yeah, and Jesse Marcel Jr., he talked for years afterwards, and he's now since passed away, but he vividly remembers his dad coming in, getting everybody up, just dumping all this shit all over the kitchen floor and be like, look at this. I crumple it up, and then it just reforms. Look, I can't scratch it. I can't cut it. I can't burn it. As like Vi's like, honey, calm down.
I am definitely picturing Bryce in this scenario. This is great.
Yeah, I think this might be my favorite part of the whole story. Again, it's just one of those humanizing moments. And we get, a son, the first real secondhand witness is in this part of the story with a guy being like, yeah, my dad came in and he showed me all this stuff. I totally remember it. So around 3 a.m., Marcel and Cavett go back to the base and examine the materials that Marcel brought back from the ranch. According to Marcel, years later, the two men tried taking a sledgehammer to one of the largest pieces of debris, which was about 2 foot long, and they found they could not make a dent in it. So picture these guys, they are on no sleep. They are guzzling pots of coffee. They're smoking, chain smoking. They're out behind one of the hangars, and they're just taking swings at this piece of crap.
Now you hit it. Go ahead, get her to hit it. Go on. You hit it now.
A morning briefing was held at 7:30 a.m. with Colonel Blanchard, Marcel Cavett, and a small group of men, including CIC officer Louis Rickett, who reported to Cavett and would later claim to not only be a witness to the debris field, but the craft itself. Blanchard's biggest concern was controlling the crash site.
Right.
It was remote and it was hard to find, but as we mentioned, the word was already flying around town that something had crashed up north. Blanchard ordered more men and MPs to the ranch to finish cleanup and collection and keep the area on lockdown. He also ordered flyovers to survey the area. And I think it's one of those flyovers that leads to the discovery of the third crash site, the main hull, which will be later this day or maybe mid-morning. Marcel was assigned to bring the debris to Fort Worth and meet with Blanchard's commanding officer, Brigadier General Ron Ramey, who would then send the materials to Wright Air Base in Ohio for examination. And I just want to mention this real quick because this came up earlier with Cavett. Cavett's his higher command was based out of Kirtland, Albuquerque. And Blanchard wanted his commander to have this materials. So that's why he assigned the job to Marcel instead of Cavett to take it to him.
Yeah, Cavett's role was really counterintelligence at the 509th. So anybody spying in and around this atomic unit, he would report straight back to Washington. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility that if Cavett thought this material was otherworldly, that it went right up the chain of command, possibly to even President Truman himself.
That had already that for sure happened, but in terms of the materials itself, the Schmitt and Randle think that he already sent his stuff ahead.
Gotcha.
But Blanchard wanted to make sure that his superior Ramey got a hold of the material, and they weren't completely that his orders weren't overrun.
Yeah.
So he made sure to slip some of this stuff to his his high command, and he had to use Marcel to do that. He couldn't use Cavett to do that because Cavett didn't ultimately answer to Ramey.
Just like today, there's a lot of infighting between military branches and units.
Well, and there's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of people who want to claim credit for this stuff.
Yeah.
And again, you have to remember, even if they're not making the jump to this is alien tech, if this stuff is Russian or foreign made, that's just as fucking important. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So why don't you talk about, because this stuff was supposedly going to be sent to Wright Air Base. What was Wright Air Base, Bryce?
Sure. So Wright Air Base was the best equipped Army air base in the country. Located just east of Dayton, Ohio, Wright Base was home to the Air Technical Intelligence Center, which would later become the Foreign Technology Division. Now, in the fall of 1942, the first...
Again, could just be another country.
In 1942, the first 12 Air Force officers to receive air technical intelligence training in, guess what? Field collection, were assigned to Wright Field for training in the technical aspects of crash intelligence. And just to give you some idea, an entire V-1 flying bomb was reverse engineered right there at Wright Base, while the post-war Operation Paperclip brought German scientists and technicians to Wright Field as well. So this is the place, in other words, the perfect place to bring a flying saucer from outer space.
So, and Marcel is headed out to Fort Worth on a B-29 called the Straight Flush, which I just think is pretty cool.
Love that, yeah.
After that meeting, Blanchard, perhaps in an attempt to squash public attempts to scour the ranch, gave Lieutenant Walter G. Haut, who's one of my favorite characters in the story, by the way, a press release to distribute to the local media, which would go on to be reported in 30 afternoon papers. The release read,
The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office at Chavez County. The flying object landed on a ranch near Roswell sometime last week. Not having phone facilities, the rancher stored the disc until such a time he was able to contact the sheriffs, who in turn notified Major Jesse A. Marcel of the 509th Bomb Group Intelligence Office.
That voice is so
like
good, bro.
slowly becoming like a Brooklyn grandmother.
Don't forget to eat your peppers.
That was great.
You're not done, Bryce.
Oh, action was immediately taken and the disc was picked up at the rancher's home. It was inspected at Roswell Army Airfield and subsequently loaned by Major Marcel to higher headquarters.
So Blanchard and Haut, they had a really close relationship. Blanchard was like a father figure to Walter Haut, and Haut had come up underneath Blanchard during World War II. He was part of all the atomic testing, and he really, really liked this guy. He would call Blanchard the old man. So when he was handed this press release, he's like, okay, if the old man wants this to go out, it's going to go out. And one of the things, when we go, why did he
Yeah.
Why did he give this press release? Well, first of all, he was base commander, so he got to call the shots on the base, Blanchard.
He has the authority.
He has the authority because it's something that's happening at the base. And according to Hout, Blanchard was really involved with the community and really wanted the Roswell community he wanted a bit of transparency of what was going on at the base.
It's hard to imagine that today, but
I know. Well, and the other thing that Blanchard, I think this was a strategic move by saying because if you read the press release, it's all past tense. They've recovered it. It's already here.
Right.
It was a way of saying, no, don't worry. There's nothing up at the ranch for anyone to see.
Right.
We
so
gotta
keeping people at bay.
Keeping people at bay and saying, don't worry. The old man's got it. We're taking a look at it. We've got a flying disc, and we'll report. We're letting you know about it. But it was really to keep people from going up there and looking for themselves, to discourage scalpers going up there to collect pieces of metal.
Can you imagine President Harry S. Truman's face when he read that headline? Probably slammed his fist down on his desk and said, "I want fucking heads to roll."
Well, the headline hadn't come out quite yet, and there was an attempt that we'll get to stop it. So Tuesday, July 8th was a very busy day, and what happened next seemed to happen all at once. Around 11 a.m., Hout went to town and personally hand-delivered the release to KGFL and the Roswell Daily Record. Hout was the PR guy for the base, and he knew all of these guys and tried not to play favorites. He'd always get shit if he visited the newspaper before the radio station and vice versa. The press release gets picked up and goes out nationwide. Now, not only the town, but the world was starting to buzz with news of a crashed flying saucer. And meanwhile, back up at the ranch, the third crash site, the Motherlode, had been discovered. By midday, a giant truck called a lowboy was hauling a large, egg-shaped object covered in a tarp down Main Street towards the airfield.
Think about that for a second, what Michael just said. A lowboy, a large truck hauling an egg-shaped object. Rubber ducky, we got ourselves a convoy here. Now, I just want to read from Witness to Roswell about a couple of kids who might have seen what was under that tarp. Richard Talbert, a Roswell Daily Record paperboy in the summer of 47, recalled for us a day in early 47 when he had just picked up his batch of the record. It was somewhere between 3 p.m. and 3:30. As near as Talbert could recall, he was plying his trade in the vicinity of the Roswell Daily Record at 4th and Main. When heading downtown, when he looked up and he saw something that he had never seen before in his young life. Heading south down Main Street was a military convoy composed of one large 18-wheel lowboy or flatbed trailer protected by an escort of jeeps in front of and behind it, each carrying a contingent of armed MPs. But it was the trailer, or what was on it, that really caught Talbert's attention that day. Quote, "The lowboy had a tarp on it and there was something under the tarp. Whatever was under there appeared to be oval-shaped. I don't recall how I did it, but I was able to get a quick look under the tarp. I think it must have not been securely tied down on one end, or it just came loose and it flapped up briefly as it went past me. Anyway, I saw a silver, oval-shaped something that was approximately 4 to 5 feet wide by about 12 feet long and 5 to 7 feet high. It had a dome on it, but it was damaged because it was cut off at one end. Bob Rich was also a paperboy that summer and saw the convoy pass right through the center of town that day."
Maybe we should have titled this episode, What the Paperboys Saw. So, Riley, calls start flooding into the base, asking questions about the crashed saucer. And Blanchard starts to freak out, and he's asking Hout to do something about all the phones ringing. And Hout's like, well, what do you want me to do? The news is already out there.
Yeah. Now, around the same time, Jesse Marcel Sr., he arrived in Fort Worth with his collection of debris and met with General Ronald Ramey. Now, I want you to picture this because the trap was set and Marcel walked right into it. Imagine Ramey. "Oh, there he is. Jesse, come on in here. Oh, you brought your box of debris. Oh, let me take a look. Oh, that is strange stuff. Why don't you set it down right on that chair right there? And hey, I got my map here in my back office. You mind showing me where you think this crash went down?" And Jesse's probably like, yeah, okay. And he sets the box down. He walks to Ramey's office. Here's my map. Now just point out on my map here where you think it went down. He does that, right? And as he comes back to where his box is, guess what? It's gone. Instead of it being there is now some other box with fucking material of a weather balloon. There's some like aluminum foil in there. There's some balsa wood, some scotch tape, the old switcheroo. Can you imagine how duped he must have felt?
Wow, that's wild.
Back at Roswell, the flying saucer story made the front page news in the Roswell Daily Record, which was the afternoon paper. And it went like this. The intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group at Roswell Army Airfield announced at noon today that the field has come into possession of a flying saucer. According to information released by the department over authority of Major J.A. Marcel, intelligence officer, the disc was removed on a ranch in the Roswell vicinity after an unidentified rancher had notified Sheriff George Wilcox here that he had found the instrument on his premises. Major Marcel and a detail from his department went to the ranch and discovered the disc, it was stated. After the intelligence officer here had inspected the instrument, it was flown to higher headquarters.
I want us to have a conversation in those voices.
I was thinking the same thing.
Beep, 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 beep. Now here, do you think it might have been an ultra-terrestrial, Michael? Please come by, reply.
Ultra-terrestrials won't be discovered until the 1960s. So this is this thing where the cat's coming out of the bag. And last week we talked about how news and radio stations and the Associated Press were being shut down with the story on the FCC by the FCC. And I think the big thing that they were trying to prevent, because look, the news was already coming out, but the big thing that they were trying to prevent from getting out is that this debris was going to leave Fort Worth and go to Wright-Patterson. Mm-hmm. That's where they wanted this story to end. That's the big goal here. Okay, they've already said they found a flying saucer. We'll fix that. What we need the public to ignore and forget and believe won't happen is that this shit's going to go to Wright base. And in fact, Ramey had called Blanchard, Blanchard, one of the two, had decided, perhaps when all these phones are ringing off the hook, we got to stop. Let's see if the Roswell Daily Record can stop that story from running. And Howe called the Roswell Daily Record and said, hey, that press release I gave you, we got to nix that story. And the Daily Record went, sorry, the afternoon paper's already gone to print. So that's the only reason that this story went to print and then was picked up in other papers.
Hey, if they can pick up all these small, tiny metallic debris, why can't they go and pick up every newspaper too?
That's true. Go around to every house.
Yes! 2
But you know what?
Brett Johnson.
It ultimately didn't matter, Bryce, because the story was already dead.
Right.
Because what happened back in Fort Worth?
Well, Ramey quickly calls for a news briefing from his office and making a public statement that what was discovered was not a flying saucer, but in fact a simple weather balloon. And a local photographer was brought in, and bewildered Marcel was forced to take a photo posing with that cheap materials and not allowed to make a statement to the press. So you remember that material that he switched him with? And then now Ramey's like, now why don't you go on and take a picture with that stuff that you mistaked as a flying saucer there, Jesse. Just right over there, take a couple photos.
Yeah, he makes the guy sit down with what looks like a fucking kite and take a picture of it. And this is supposed to be the material that these experienced men from the 509th Bomb Squadron were unable to recognize.
Yeah. Now, something interesting and what I think is so damning of Ronald Ramey and his cover-up is that the Washington Post reported that Ramey informed the Pentagon press office that the object was in his office. And as a matter of fact, I'm looking at it right now and I can tell that it's a weather balloon. But you know what? It hadn't even arrived yet. In other words, Jesse Marcel hadn't even got off the plane from Roswell to Fort Worth yet. And Ramey's already sending out telegrams to newspaper agencies saying, I'm looking at the material right here and it's clearly a weather balloon. It reminds me of A Few Good Men, right? When Colonel Jessup ordered the transfer of Santiago, but then his clothes were still in his locker. Like, bullshit, Colonel Jessup. Don't lie to me. I want the truth and I can handle it.
That's right.
really are going back to the 90s. Ramey assured the public that the flight to Wright Air Base was canceled. It was all a simple mistake. Nothing to see here, folks. Marcel, meanwhile, returned to Roswell that afternoon, dejected and humiliated. Back at RAAF, the base was buzzing with activity. Marcel marched into Cabot's office and asked the man what was going on. What was that about a weather balloon? What happened while he was away? And here's an excerpt from... Here is an excerpt from Witness to Roswell on how that conversation went.
Okay, this is me being Jesse Marcel.
And I'll play Sheridan Cabot.
I want to see the report of what happened here while I was in Fort Worth.
What report? I don't know what you're talking about.
I outrank you.
Sorry, I take my orders from Washington. If you don't like it, you can take it up with them.
Don't give me that laissez-faire attitude. You know damn well what I'm talking about. What happened while I was in Fort Worth?
I can't hear you. Marcel was ordered by Colonel Blanchard to no longer discuss the flying disc. He would return to his wife and son that night and tell them that they, too, could never talk about what they'd seen on their kitchen floor. In fact, Marcel would stay silent on the matter for 3 more decades.
And that must have killed him, man.
Just sidebar issue here, a little funny anecdote that comes up, because Cabot and Marcel were neighbors.
Yeah.
And apparently, just after, even after that conversation, even after he was ordered not to, Jesse Jr., I believe, tells this story that Cabot came over to Marcel's house and they were playing bridge with their wives. And Jesse and Cabot, or Jesse and Sheridan, or Marcel and Cabot, however you want to call them, were in the kitchen with another piece of debris that they hadn't turned over, and they were trying to melt it on the stovetop and couldn't get it to melt. So these guys were still fascinated by whatever it was that they found.
Absolutely.
And the wives were playing bridge, and they're like, hey, we're trying to play a game here. And the two men decided we probably shouldn't have this anyway. They went outside, and when they came back, the debris was gone, and Jesse Jr. never found out whatever happened to it.
That's exactly right. I mean, politics aside, this is when probably 2 friends, 2 really intelligent guys, were just trying to figure out what the hell this material was and where it came from.
Right.
And off the record, they probably had a lively debate.
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm not so sure. I think once that week was done, they ran, and I think once everyone was kind of like scared into shutting up about it, they did shut up. Dennis Balthazar, that guy who did the Roswell tour that I went on, he showed us the Cabot house and the Sheridan house. And it sounds like sometimes they would even carpool to work together, and they would not talk about it. So I don't know. It really seems to sound that once this week ends, that these dudes did not talk about it until they were old and dying.
Yep.
So the next day, Wednesday, July 9th, the papers reported that the RAAF had made a dumb mix-up and that there was no flying saucer. Marcel's now infamous photo appeared on the front page of the Daily Courier. He's holding what looked like obvious tinfoil. And I want our listeners, we'll put this on the Instagram, take a look, and Riley, if you can, Google Jesse Marcel photo. If you can find this picture of Marcel holding up these materials, you can see the look in his eye. He looks like a guy who just had a fast one pulled on him and knows he can't say anything about it because he's not able to.
Yeah.
There's just this look on his face like, you gotta be fucking kidding me.
Well, he's stunned and he's pissed, and why wouldn't he be? He was just supposed to accept the fact that from now on, he was going to be known in the public eye as the dummy who couldn't tell a weather balloon from a flying saucer.
Yeah, it's quite a photo. It's good.
So what else? And so there's also another photo from the press conference where Ramey is holding up, not actually holding up, he's holding a piece of paper in his hand that looks like a telegram or a message. And this is something that ufologists have locked on to in the past couple decades. This is, what is this?
I love this, right? So General Ronald Ramey's little staged photo op backfires, and I'll tell you why. It's known as the Ramey Memo, or
backfires like 5 decades later.
5 decades later, backfires. It's known as the smoking gun of evidence, Riley. Now, in Fort Worth, Texas, Fort Worth Star telegram photographer, he took 6 photographs of General Ramey and his adjutant, Colonel Thomas Dubose, sitting with the substituted weather balloon and radar target on General Ramey's floor. Now, 4 of those photos show Ramey holding a teletype memo. Well, he probably never thought that one day, with computer technology, we would be able to read just what exactly was on that memo. Well, guess what? A Dr. David Rudiak, a research scientist, spent 2 years doing just that. Using computer imaging technology, he was able to decode what the official Air Force GAO investigation said couldn't be done. The Ramey memo reads in part:
Fort Worth Army Airfield acknowledges that a disc, in quotes, is the next new find west of the cordon, and the victims of the wreck you forwarded to the team at Fort Worth, Texas. The aviators in the disc, in quotes, shipped them by B-29ST, Special Transport, or C-47.
Now, in my Ancient Aliens voice, victims? Disc aviators? Shh. I think that says it all.
So this memo that Ramey's holding in his hand supposedly acknowledges the fact that it was a disc and that there were bodies found.
Yeah, victims, man. You don't describe victims in a fucking weather balloon. Or
now this is
hello.
This is one of those things that's a little controversial because even blown up, the memo looks very, very blurry.
Okay.
So I think, but I've seen it, and it does. I can see where they're getting the word disc and victims. I can see how they're doing it.
You know what? David Rudiak he has a whole website dedicated to his research, and
trust me, after the 2 episodes we've done on this, I'm sure he does.
Yeah,
because I'm about to start my own Squarespace site on Roswell.
Oh my God, you could tell the way this guy operated in trying to figure out what those words on that memo were. I mean, he basically, he figured out how many letters were in each word, and you could see some of the letters clearly, some not. But then he went through the entire English alphabet and eliminated and made possibilities of what those words could be. And I mean, when you read that victims, aviators of the, in quotes, disc ship, I mean, it's hard not to think alien bodies.
It's true, though. But victims always kind of bumps me because it's like victims. I guess they're car crash victims, right?
Exactly. That's just terminology.
Yeah,
I'm looking at this now. It's pretty cool.
I mean, it is very ingenious, and it is very smart for nerds, a generation later to go, hey, wait a minute, what's that guy holding in his hand? And then be able to actually figure it out.
Yeah.
So after Ramey's press conference, news about flying saucers started to die down around the country. Most of the general public chalked flying discs up to misidentified weather balloons or other aerial phenomenon. The age of there's no such thing as UFOs began, despite proof we have today with the recent New York Times stories on the subject that our government has never stopped studying unidentified aerial threats, and that some career politicians, like former Senator Harry Reid, have proposed as recently as this year that materials not of this earth are currently in possession of both the government and private sectors. This echoes Marcel's very statement on December 1979 when he was interviewed by Bob Pratt.
Jesse Marcel's words, quote,
"It was nothing we had ever seen before. It was not an aircraft of any kind. That I'm sure of. We didn't know what it was. It was nothing made on this earth."
End quote. And Riley, that goes back to what Michael was just saying, what you were talking about. Didn't somebody have some of this material? I mean, there was so much of it. It has to be somewhere. Well, perhaps this is, some of these meta materials that the New York Times articles are talking about, materials that, were in possession of Linda Moulton Howe, materials that were sent to Art Bell on his Coast to Coast radio program.
Robert Bigelow had some of this stuff.
Robert Bigelow has some of this stuff that show these isotopic properties that don't match anything of this earth, that are these strange, compacted, multi layers of materials stacked on top of each other that technically we would just have a hard time recreating today with our current technology. So perhaps, some of this stuff is still floating around.
I hope so. Man.
The Roswell story remained a dormant beast for 3 decades until UFO researchers like Stanton Friedman, William Moore, and Carl T. Flock began to search through a backlog of government documents through the Freedom of Information Act and kick the dragon awake in the late 70s. The generation that followed Marcel's weren't buying the numerous explanations from the U.S. government about what really happened at Roswell. First, it was Ramey's weather balloon. Then in 1994, the government admitted it lied back in 1947 and said what really happened was that the military was covering up Project Mogul, a high-altitude spying network trying to detect Russian nuclear tests. Then, in 1997, after demands for explanations about the supposed bodies discovered in the wreckage, the government released another explanation saying that, yes, there were bodies, but they were dummies, part of a project called Operation High Dive, where they apparently just tossed mannequins from high altitudes to see what would happen.
Right.
This was a real thing. The only problem with it as an explanation, it didn't begin until 1959, 12 years after the events at Roswell.
I mean, this just proves that the government is lying, because you can't have 4 explanations. They can't all be true. And as a matter of fact, when asked how the public was supposed to accept the fact, considering a 10-plus year time difference, that the Air Force responded with a theory about as laughable as swamp gas, they stated this in reference to Operation High Dive.
Quote, "The witnesses were unwitting victims of a mental processing affliction known as time compression, whereby recollections of past events tend to contract the time frames in which they took place as a person ages."
End quote. So yeah, basically the government would like you to believe that the numerous witnesses who claim to have seen alien bodies from the Roswell crash in 47 were really just remembering a chance encounter with crash test dummies in the middle of the fucking New Mexico desert. Come on!
Yeah, in 1959.
Yeah, 10 years later or whatever.
Right. Time compression. Thanks, government.
So, Bryce, what are we supposed to make of all this talk about little bodies?
Well, we are going to get into that, Michael, and that is going to be saved for really our final culmination of this incredible podcasting Roswell series. We're going to cover that in
now you're calling our own podcast.
I'm lost on my pages, so I'm going off book, but that will be covered in Roswell Part 3.
Fair enough. So there you go. Roswell Part 2's in the can. Next week, we are going to get into the bodies. We're going to get into a few more of the witnesses on the base, and wrap this thing up, hopefully with, with an idea of what actually went down.
Yeah, I mean, and hopefully Michael and I have done a good job at painting a picture that this was not a weather balloon, that there perhaps were bodies of something from somewhere. In other words, this is really starting to look like a physical craft from somewhere with pilots that suffered in this fatal crash, and with possibly leaving one of these alien entities alive.
I gotta say, you guys you're kind of blowing my mind here, and very well told, very well researched, and I 100% believe that this was not a weather balloon. This very much sounds like a cover up.
Where are you feeling at? Where are you at after hearing this part, as opposed to where you were at the end of part 1?
I mean, I definitely 100% believe it was a cover up now. Before it was. Well, I pretty much always believed it was a cover-up, to be honest. But, you've painted the picture a lot more clearly, and I would say where I'm at differently now is that the material is extremely intriguing to me, and I want it to exist somewhere in the world. I mean, if it really was all this was collected and it's indestructible, it's sitting somewhere in some bunker somewhere. So that's the key to this whole thing, you know. And
well, it's fun.
I don't know, maybe it is that's what's that New York Times article is alluding to. That would really be something.
Or something like it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It supports the New York Times stuff that's been coming out this summer. It makes what happened in Roswell more, or what, you know, ufologists hope happened in Roswell. It makes it a little bit more plausible, right? It helps corroborate these stories, whether it's the same actual physical material or not.
I think the thing that I've gotten to also is that this doesn't seem like it was in any way intentional by the military. And in my mind, the two options are it's some sort of extraterrestrial interdimensional craft, or they just fucked up in a big way on some kind of very secret project they were working on.
Well, and we're going to float a couple of those theories at the end of next week's episode as well.
Hey guys, Bryce here. Look, I know you know that I know you know that I love all things strange, especially elusive North American wood apes who shall remain nameless. Bigfoot. It's Bigfoot. But did you also know that I created and developed a hilarious new party game called Dirty Picture Cover-Up? You see, the idea came to me when I was in high school, and I had to cover up all the dirty drawings my friends would draw in my yearbook so that I could show it to my parents without having them realize just what a bunch of degenerates my friends were. And believe me, they were. It was then that I realized that not only is it fun to draw dirty pictures, but it's even more fun to cover them up and turn them into something not dirty. And so, Dirty Picture Cover-Up, or DPCU, was born. The game is simple. Draw a dirty picture, cover it up, be judged, win. And as a way to say thanks for supporting, I'm offering our listeners a 15% discount by using the promo code BIGFOOT. Okay, fine, I'm obsessed with Bigfoot, and you'll be obsessed with DPCU. To get yours, just head over to thedpcugame.com. That's thedpcugame.com and get yours today.
Okay, get ready, Riley, because it's time for our conclusion to the Roswell Saga. And I don't know where we're going to end on the other side of this.
I do. I know right where we're going to end.
Alien
bodies. Alien bodies. That's right, Riley.
That's what we promised last week, that we would get into the aliens this week. And oh my God, like everything else in this story, there's so much. So why don't we get right into it? Here we go,
let's jump
kids.
right in.
Club Scouts, insert sticks into marshmallows, hover over campfire now.
Okay.
Sure. It's a campfire story.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Here we go, kids. In parts 1 and part 2 of our story on Roswell, we discussed a legendary flying saucer crash of 1947 from the perspectives of Mac Brazel, the humble ranch hand who discovered strange debris on Foster Ranch in Corona, New Mexico, and Jesse Marcel Sr., the Army major from Roswell Army Airfield assigned to collect, examine, and deliver the materials to General Roger Ramey in Fort Worth, Texas. It was Ramey who immediately retracted the Army's original story that they'd recovered a crashed flying saucer and replaced it with a downed weather balloon.
In this chapter, we're going to take a look at the witnesses who claim to have had a close encounter with the dead occupants of the crashed flying disc before it was officially determined to be a flying man-made instrument, and what may have happened to the little, not-so-green men after the American public accepted that nothing exciting ever happened in the sleepy little town of Roswell, New Mexico.
It's time for the conclusion to our Roswell trilogy with Part 3, The Bodies That No One Saw. The first mention of alien bodies discovered in the crash at Corona came when Mac Brazel cryptically mentioned to radio DJ Frank Joyce during a phone call at the sheriff's station that he'd found horrible-smelling, non-human beings while collecting debris up at the Foster Ranch.
The stench.
unfortunate little creatures. God damn it, they're not monkeys, and they're not human.
The discovery of at least 2 alien beings at a second crash site 2.5 miles from the first one, the debris field, was corroborated by Sidney Jack Wright, who was a boy at the time, who claimed,
"There were bodies, small bodies with big heads and eyes, and Mac was there too. We couldn't get away from there fast enough. But it didn't matter. They was in our brains forever. The sight of that. Won't you see that? You'll never see anything again that looks normal. I can't remember the last time I made love to a woman where I didn't see those jumbo alien eyes looking up at me right while I was coming."
Are we still on the record right now? Is this,
Yeah.
Always
Yes.
on the record.
Yes!
This is direct quote.
End quote.
The third supposed person to see these 2 bodies was the youngest witness in the story of Roswell, 7-year-old D. Proctor. Throughout his entire life, D refused to speak to investigators about what he saw. He died a morbidly obese alcoholic at the age of 66 in 2006. According to Dee's mother, Loretta Proctor, who also got a glimpse at the strange memory medal Brazel and Dee found, her son acted as if he'd seen something that terribly frightened and disturbed him. The boy would grow up seemingly traumatized by what he saw and refused to speak about it even to family members. He only hinted at what he discovered to his mother in 1994, when he drove her out to a ridge about 2 miles from where Mac had found the debris in 1947 and cryptically spoke the words, "Here's where Mac found something else." I mean, this poor guy, dying a just traumatized alcoholic at a relatively young age. I mean, this is truly, I think D. Proctor is truly like the worst part of this story.
Yeah.
And it just shows you what an impact this had on people.
Yeah.
As we covered in part 2, if Major Jesse Marcel Sr. ever saw a body, he never spoke about it publicly. Even when blowing the lid off the weather balloon cover story to UFO investigators in the late 70s. Extended family members shared secondhand stories involving Jesse mentioning quote-unquote pygmy bodies, but we don't really know. We can only assume that if Mac had found 2 bodies, he would have directed Marcel and Cavett to their location. But if so, we don't know why Marcel never talked about the alien beings himself.
The aliens at the center of today's episode primarily comes from the third crash site, about 40 miles southeast of the debris field. This is where the front half of the saucer was discovered with 3 to 4 more alien beings, one rumored to still be alive. This likely occurred sometime late on Monday, July 7th, or in the morning hours of Tuesday, July 8th, after Colonel William Blanchard had ordered additional troops and military police to quarantine the ranch and ordered flyovers of the area.
And here's kind of where, when we get back into this weird timeline that we're trying to piece together, you know, I forgot the fact that if they found bodies on the 7th if Marcel and Cavett saw those bodies with Mac Brazel, then those probably got shipped to the base by the end of that day. And then that night or early in the next morning is when they find this impact site. So from everything that we're going to hear, there was a total of 4 bodies.
Right.
But
maybe even more. Yeah.
Maybe more. If you count the 1 or 2 at the second site and then the 3 or 4 at the third site, we might have as many as 5, maybe 6. I would say, though, and this is just me thinking off the cuff, probably no more than 5.
Yeah.
Probably no more than 5 aliens.
Well, I know what you're talking about, right? Because I get that Marcel and Cavett, you know, go out to the debris field and collect as much as they can and bring it back, you know? But if they saw those bodies, would they have left them there? Would they have known what to do? Would they have been like, let's come back for these? I don't know.
It would have made sense. Then that's why Cavett left at noon, contacted Kirtland in Albuquerque, which contacted, Washington.
Yeah.
It would make sense why Blanchard sent more troops up that day.
I mean, because you don't want to touch those things. You know, you might want to get a biohazard unit out there immediately. Or
who knows? I mean, back in the 40s, a biohazard unit was just a man in an ice cream truck.
Right. Right. Bing, 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 bing.
I'm here to pick up your aliens.
Because Blanchard sent up more men that day, and then the next morning on Tuesday, July 8th, he sends up even more and orders flyovers. But you got to think, okay, if there was a chance that Brazel was like, oh, by the way, I got to show you something else. That's, this is when they started really putting on high alert and wanted to get up and lock this place down.
Agreed.
So this is a bit of speculation on our part. Although it is backed up by research done by Tom Carey, Donald Schmitt, and Kevin D. Randle in their books UFO Crash at Roswell and Witness to Roswell, respectively. But the third crash site may have been discovered in part by Air Transport Unit pilot Captain Oliver W. Pappy Henderson. In 1988, after reading the Roswell story and a description of the aliens in a tabloid, he confessed to his wife Sappho that he had flown a C-54 with the first load of wreckage to Wright Airfield in Ohio after Ramey publicly recanted the story. Although he did not go into detail, he remarked to his wife, I suppose I can talk about this now, and told her that flying saucers were real and that the description of the bodies in the tabloid were true. During a deathbed confession in 1997, Henderson described the shape of the alien bodies like that of Casper the cartoon ghost.
Weird.
As one of Blanchard's trusted pilots, it stands to reason he could have been one of the men doing flyovers on July 7th or 8th that led to the discovery of the third crash site. The truth is, we don't really know exactly who discovered that impact site. It may have been E.L. Barney Barnett from last episode, or a group of archaeologist students, or both. And it may have been as early as the 7th of July or sometime in the morning hours of July 8th.
Wild. I mean, that's incredible, I mean, here's a guy saying, finally to his wife over some Salisbury steak, I think I can tell you now. Sappho. Her name was Sappho?
Sappho, Viod. What? These are like, what happened to these 40s names?
I don't know.
Why aren't we researching how people were naming their babies back in the 1910s and 20s? The other thing that really kind of pops up here with that description of Casper, the ghost. Now, of course, you're thinking of that little body and big head, but it sort of echoes last week when we talked about how Sue Marcel Methane, one of Jesse Marcel's extended family members, recalled him describing the bodies as white powdery figures.
Yeah, so there's a common thread there. It's hard to ignore. Yeah. We know for a fact that numerous military witnesses in the twilight of their lives who were ready to meet their maker and wanted to clear their conscience went on record to categorically state that they were there when it happened, they held the wreckage, and they saw the bodies. Ed Sain was a PFC member of the 390th Air Service Squadron attached to the 509th Bomb Group at RAAF. He told his son Raymond years after the fact that he and Corporal Raymond Van Wy were assigned to guard the bodies that had been stored in a tent up at the impact site until they were transported to the base. According to Raymond, his father was extremely reluctant to talk about what happened due to being under a security oath and fearing for his life if he said anything. Now, the tent comes up again in the story told by 26-year-old Sergeant Frederick Benthal, a photographic specialist serving in the Army Air Forces. Benthal had helped film the atomic bomb testing during Operation Crossroads. Benthal was stationed in Washington, D.C. at the time of the Roswell incident and was flown in to the crash site with Corporal Al Kirkpatrick. Once at the site, Benthal claimed he was sent into one of the tents to take photos of the alien bodies and of some of the debris. Before their ride back to the base, Benthal's camera and film were confiscated. When they got back to Washington, a Marine lieutenant colonel named Bibby asked the men a question.
Sergeant, sit on down. Your wife good? Great. Now I want to ask you something. Do you know what you photographed in New Mexico? Yes, sir.
Wrong! You do not know what you photographed. Now I will ask you again. Do you know what you photographed?
No, sir.
That's a hell of a lot better, Sergeant. Dismissed.
Tough guy.
I mean, Benthal, this guy, what a cool dude. He's a photographer. He took all the photos of the atomic bomb testing. I mean, that's pretty rad. But
Yeah.
he's the guy they called to be like, he takes photos of all the other top secret shit. Let's get him to take pictures of these aliens.
Yeah, keep in mind this is 47. They didn't have iPhones with cameras. I mean, this guy had specialized camera equipment with with flash bulbs, and they brought him into this dark tent where for over an hour, he said, he walked around the table taking picture after picture of these bodies.
And this guy like basically designed the way to film atomic testing. And he said that after Roswell, he was, Riley, get a load of this, he was reassigned to the Antarctic.
No.
Yeah.
They shipped him off to Antarctica after this.
That's
This
enough
part
out of
of the
you,
story
boy.
is honestly blowing my mind. This is crazy.
So Sergeant Leroy Wallace was also assigned to the 390th as an MP, and his widow claims that he had been sent up to Corona to assist with a crash site. He returned home the next morning reeking of a terrible stench. She told Carey and Schmitt for their book Witness to Roswell,
"Ooh, the stench on his clothes was the worst smell you could ever imagine. I had to strip off his clothes. We ultimately burned them and buried the ashes. You know, I had to strip off his clothes because he didn't want to touch them. And I thought to myself, well, if you already smell, if your body is already all smelly, now my hands are going to touch them. But I have these very, very thick gloves that I use for dishwashing because, you know, if your hands get too hot under the hot water, it just dries out the nail. And so those gloves, I threw them away after. But yeah, we had to burn the clothes, and that smell too. Oh my goodness. It was like a rotting flesh chemical smell, and coyotes tried to dig them up for months after. I think they thought there was a person there, but they had little success at it. But I don't know if there's a law against burying burned clothes and ashes in the backyard, but thank God no one ever found them. These days I would do it differently. I think they probably make tubes or something at the Container Store. I don't know. The smell haunts me. It's still in my nose hairs.
Okay.
Wallace had been traumatized by his duties collecting the bodies. He began to bathe obsessively, scrubbing away at his body with lye and a coarse brush until his skin was red and raw.
He walked around for 2 days after he returned home. Did not sleep. Didn't speak either. There was just a 50-yard death stare in his eyes, like a man home from war. And for the next 2 weeks when he ate, he wore gloves because the smell was still on his body. Well, you know who you should really be talking to, him. But he's dead. But he's got all the stories. I don't know if he would tell you. He would always say to me, it's top secret, top secret. I can't even be talking about the fact that I have something to talk about. I never knew if it was real or he just didn't want to talk to me, you know. That's how things were back then. You know, men went to work and they didn't talk about it with their wives, and there was so many secrets about him, and not even ones that had to do anything with UFOs, just secrets. Secrets a man has in his heart. You know, there was a woman that he loved dearly, and she married someone else, and, you know, I always wonder if he would wonder about her in our intimate moments. You never know what's going on in a marriage, in a man's mind. And so we didn't have the best marriage, but that's what you did back then. You picked someone and you settled down for comfort. You stayed together and you waited it out until one of you died.
Shortly after the cleanup at Corona, Wallace was transferred out of Roswell. So again, another dude who saw something sent away.
Right, I want to hear that like transfer stamp sound effect. You know?
Yeah, you can really echo this. Give this one a really good echo effect, Riley. Transfer.
Great.
Nice.
So what did the aliens look like?
Good question.
Sergeant Melvin E. Brown was one of the men assigned to guard the trucks that hauled the egg-shaped section of the craft and the bodies from the impact site back to base at Roswell. Although he was ordered to guard the trucks and not look under the tarp, please, why are you obsessed with my magical closet of mysteries? That joke from Simpsons. Like, he's like, all right, soldier, we know everyone's acting super weird. We know there's some weird shit happening right now. You need to guard this truck, and whatever you do, do not look underneath it. Brown's curiosity got the better of him, and he peeked under the tarp and saw, why wouldn't you, one of the bodies. According to Brown, the skin of the being looked yellowish orange, which was possibly a result of decomposition. The skin had a reptilian mesh-like quality, not scaly, but leathery and beaded like the hide of a lizard.
Lizard people. Wow, that's
reptoids.
Wild. Reptoids. I mean, here's where we start to get all this stuff. I don't know. If that doesn't give you the heebie-jeebies, then perhaps this will. Frankie Dwyer, a 12-year-old girl in 1947, testified that her father, Dan Dwyer, was the crew chief for the Roswell Fire Department at the time of the crash. And when a call came into the fire station that there had been a crash north of town, Dan and his partner, Lee Reeves, took the call. Arriving before the military, Dan would later describe to his daughter what they stumbled upon out in the middle of that desert. He said they came upon, unquote, an egg-shaped vessel that was certainly not an airplane. Even more disturbing there were 3 diminutive, human-like but not human bodies that to his trained eyes were obvious victims of the crash. But it was when, out of the corner of his eye, that another being, still alive, stumbled out from behind the crash that Dwyer realized he was in way over his head. When he finally made it home that evening, he spilled his guts to his daughter Frankie, and when she asked him, "Daddy, what did they look like?" he simply replied, "Child of the earth. They looked like childs of the earth," referring to the cricket-like insect with the large head and bulging black eyes.
Yeah, a Jerusalem cricket. We talked about this story briefly during the Roswell Slides Hoaxbusters episode over on the other side, so that might ring a bell.
If you're driving in your car, Google it right now and look at it. I mean, alien head, that's what you're going to look at.
I mean, it's a cricket. It's a big, nasty-looking cricket with, like, what looks like kind of an alien gray face with antenna. But this story here, this is one of those that I kind of put into the E.L. Barnett legend, like Roswell legends. I don't know if this is really considered canon. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But because this thing bumps me with the idea of her dad, the fire station, getting a call about a crash before the military would. Where does that fit into the timeline? And I think it fits in when, even if you think it's Barney Barnett calling that in, or the archaeological students, they were supposedly kicked out by the military. So I don't know when this happens.
I mean, it's hard to know, but look, you know, Roswell, the town of Roswell was a buzz about this crash before even the military knew about it. So it's not out of the realm of possibility to think that the Roswell Fire Department had got a call, whether it was from a concerned townsman or an actual call itself. But you know, the fact that they went out there is crazy to think. And I know what you're talking about. Like, it doesn't really go on to say like what he did after he saw those alien bodies, because obviously if you're a fire chief, you're probably trained in some sort of emergency response. Did he tend to this alive alien? Did he, you know, fucking pack up his, well, not me, hightail it out of there? I don't know, you know.
And this is where we get into the problem of secondhand stories versus firsthand stories. You know, if Dan Dwyer had been able to tell this story, he might have said, no, I actually saw that at the base, you know, or I saw that because we'll learn as we go further that the ambulance for the base was often used. They had a contract with the local mortician. So it's possible that they had a contract with the local fire department.
Most definitely.
And they brought the fire department up there with them, and that it's just the memory of a 12-year-old girl trying to piece together and remember exactly what her dad said. The game of telephone. The game of telephone over 30, 40 years, can really change the way that stories are told as they're being handed down.
No, that's a great point, because look, they're testing all different kinds of aircraft out there and different things, and I'm sure that that crashes took place, and that the military, the Roswell Army Airfield, called on that local fire department out of Roswell to help assist. I mean, they had the only water trucks probably in town.
And I think that Frankie might have been the daughter of a fireman who was told that little girls go missing all the time in the desert if they didn't keep quiet. I have to tell that anecdote in every episode because it scares me so bad.
Deeply creepy.
Oh, wait. Okay, this one will match our transferred sound effect. Ready?
Threatened.
By most accounts, the description of the beings are consistent, with the exception of Brown's report of the jaundice-colored skin. The witnesses that followed generally describe what we would consider today to be alien grays. The entities were said to be 3 to 4.5 feet tall, with bluish-gray, reptilian-like skin. Their bodies were frail and narrow, weighing at about 40 pounds. Their heads were oversized, with wide-set, slanted, almond-shaped eyes, 2 slits for a nose with a slight narrow bridge. And the beings had no ears, just holes on the sides of their heads. Their mouths were described as being lipless slits that seemed to serve no purpose for speech or eating food. Because when opened, the mouths were revealed to be just a 2-inch deep pocket. They had no observable digestive tract and no genitalia, although a nurse who oversaw the autopsy back at the base said that this could have been due to predators that had gnawed them off in the desert.
She just can't get over the fact that they don't have dicks. I love it.
They don't have dicks!
Well, they must have been chewed off or something.
Somebody sent a hunting party out for a coyote. There's a coyote with some alien balls in its mouth right now.
Somebody chewed off those dicks. That's all I'm saying. Back to the bodies. Go ahead.
Because the creatures had been out in the elements so long, they were in varying states of decomposition and had been obviously preyed upon by desert scavengers. I gotta stop and talk about this fucking mouth for a minute.
Yeah, that's creepy.
That shit is wild.
Yeah. Yep.
And
pocket mouth?
Pocket mouth?
Pocket mouth.
Because think about this. I'm going to pull a Bryce and say, now just stop and think about that for a minute. Pause for a minute.
Imagine the scene.
This to me says that these aliens are then not in fact biological creatures by any sense of the word as we know it. If they don't speak, they don't eat, they don't have a digestive tract, this to me says that these are some sort of bioengineered robot of some kind.
Absolutely, man. Artificial intelligence, drones.
And it perhaps they are specifically designed to pilot these ships. So it'd be kind of like if you built a plane and then cloned the pilot as the plane's operating system. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Because they said that these crafts are like 12 to 15 feet in diameter and 4 or 5 feet high. If I'm like one of those tall whites or a draconian reptilian alien, and who knows what this interstellar or interdimensional space travel is like, you might go, well, we need a craft this size, but we're too big to fit in them. Why don't we grow our own pilots?
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, look, we send drones to Mars. We send drones and satellites to outer space. It's not out of the realm of possibility to think that whatever this species was that they were doing the same thing, that these are part of a scouting mission, It's
just like all the Russian and Chinese drones that are chasing our F-15 fighters.
Right.
I mean, it's either something wild like that, which is very sci-fi and I'm like super into, or it's a being like us in the future, and we've like evolved past the need for a mouth and a digestive tract, that we are just like, now we just communicate with telepathy, and we've figured out a way to nourish our bodies without having to actually eat.
There are those hippies that say they get all their nourishment from the sun alone. Maybe they're like that,
These damn space hippies.
That's what it is.
But they say
space
that
hippies.
They say that our pinky finger is smaller because we're evolving away from the need of the pinky finger because we're not hanging on to branches anymore. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So
what about shredding guitar solos?
Yeah. Dude, you got to keep it alive. You got to keep that pinky alive,
keep
bro.
the pinkies alive.
Guys, please keep the pinkies alive.
I love this idea of the cyborg robot part biological. I mean, it's Terminator, but
or it's
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's like some half clone, half. Maybe these are the things that they're collecting from us when they abduct us. Maybe it's human DNA mixed with some sort of artificial life. You know what I mean? Maybe that's why they need us. Maybe that's why they need us, is so our hybrids become the pilots of these crafts.
Definitely. And look, here's another thought too, right? If these creatures are so far advanced with their technology and with their AI, perhaps then they've already met with the singularity. In other words, perhaps their technological prowess has gained a consciousness, so that these little drones perhaps might have consciousness of their own, and that are able to interact with their vehicle, quite like Bob Lazar stated about what he thought he knew about how the vehicles were operated. Who knows?
I mean, DNA is like the ultimate coding language, right? Like the language of DNA wrote this code of all life that we live with. Like, and if a species could get to the point that they could like interface with that directly and kind of fuse that line between computer and biological technology, it's like, a holistic technology that exists within nature. Like, why couldn't they design?
I mean, we hear like these rumors of them being like some silicon-based life form. You know what I mean? Maybe that's
right.
That's what these things are. It's so fucking weird. Remember, if this is from another planet or another dimension, who the fuck knows? With technology way beyond ours, that little fucking pocket mouth is so creepy to me. I just picture it like hiding things in there.
I picture him putting his tiny little pinky in there.
Maybe that's where they're hiding the penises, huh?
That's where their penises.
Solve that one.
That makes sense to me. I'm just saying, that makes sense to me.
Well, as we're going to hear in a little bit, they didn't have pinkies, so this might actually support my theory. One of the surprising witnesses to the Roswell incident was New Mexican Lieutenant Governor Joseph M. Little Joe Montoya. Montoya was visiting the RAAF on Monday, July 7th, the day that the first bodies, presumably from the second crash site, arrived. According to Montoya's close friends, two brothers and Roswell citizens, and next-door neighbors, Ruben and Pete Anaya, the lieutenant governor was on the base that day to perform the dedication of a new airplane. As trucks started arriving from Corona with debris and bodies, Montoya apparently got a look at the debris and the aliens as they were being rushed into Hangar P3, known today as Building 84. In a panicked phone call to the Anaya family, Montoya asked Ruben, who was a base cook, to come pick him up at RAAF.
I'm at the big hangar. Get your car, Ruben, and pick me up. Get me the hell out of here. Hurry.
Ruben recalled pulling up to the hangar and watching as Montoya burst out a side door and ran to his car like a bat out of hell. Back at Ruben's house, Montoya collapsed on the couch and demanded a drink. He threw back a tumbler of scotch and raved about what he'd seen to the Anaya brothers.
I've got to calm myself down. You are not going to believe what I've just seen. If you ever tell anyone I call you a damn liar, we don't know what it is. There was a flying saucer. They saw it. It moves like a platter, a plane without wings, un plato muy grande con una máquina en la media.
Montoya shot to his feet and exclaimed that he saw little men and that incredibly one was still alive.
I know, because I could hear him moaning.
Montoya, a short man himself, described the beings as being as tall as his chest.
They were so skinny, they didn't look human. From what I could see, they had 4 long fingers. They had large, bald heads. I wasn't close enough to see what color their eyes were, but they were larger than normal. I tell you, they were not of this world!
After a brief power nap, Montoya escaped to the Nikon Hotel in downtown Roswell, which was owned by his brother. The next day, the Anaya brothers went to check on the lieutenant governor, who quietly informed them.
Confidentially, they shipped everything to Texas. The little guys are in the hospital.
Montoya told them that they had to keep quiet about this wild information. That night, the brothers were paid a visit by one Sheriff Wilcox, who warned them that if they ever talked with anyone about anything that the lieutenant governor told them, everybody, including their children, would be killed.
Threat! Nice.
Whenever the brothers would try to discuss the matter with Montoya, he would simply tell them,
It's too dangerous to talk about. If you talk about it, someone, maybe not the FBI, but someone in the government, will do away with you.
As the wreckage and the bodies arrived at the base, PFC Eli Benjamin, a security officer for the 390th ASS providing assistance to the 509th, was ordered to grab his gun and report to Hangar P3. Bryce is going to read his account that was told to the authors of Witness to Roswell.
I got myself ready, got my gun, and reported to the big hangar as ordered. As near as I can recall, it was late afternoon or early evening at the time. While looking for my OIC, which stands for Officer in Charge, to get instructions for duties at the hangar, I came upon a commotion taking place at the main entrance to the hangar. Some MPs were trying to subdue an out-of-control officer who, among other things, appeared to be drunk as a skunk. I found out later that the officer in question was from my squadron and was the very officer to whom I was to report for a special detail. This officer, whose name I cannot now recall, was to have overseen the transfer of several, quote, top-secret items from the big hangar to the base hospital, and I was there to help escort the transfer. I was later told that he had been to the crash site and had seen the ship. When this officer reported to the hangar and saw the small bodies, it was apparently too much for him to handle, and he just lost it. At this point, having just arrived myself, a major or lieutenant colonel that came out of the hangar looked over the situation and pointed at me. "You, come over here," he said. "You're now in charge of this detail. Get these over to the base hospital, now!"
He then pointed to 3 or 4 gurneys inside the hangar, each of which had something on it that was covered by a sheet.
On one of the gurneys, whatever was under the sheet appeared to me to be moving. I saluted my acceptance and understanding of his order and instructed the rest of the men in the detail to load the gurneys with their payload onto the back of a truck that had just arrived for that purpose. Up to this point, I had no idea what we were transporting to the hospital. I would know soon enough, however. As the men were loading the truck, one of the gurneys slipped during the handoff, and the sheet covering it fell away, revealing the grayish face and swollen, hairless head of a species that I realized was not human. My orders were to deliver these to the base's hospital emergency room and remain there until relieved. Upon arriving at the emergency room ramp, we proceeded to unload. I went in with the first gurney and stood aside near the doorway as the medical people took control of the gurney. A half dozen or so medical and non-medical officers quickly removed the covering sheet. I couldn't see too well from where I was standing because of the number of officers gathered around the gurney, but I could see well enough to make out that a very small person with an egg-shaped head that was oversized for its body was laying on the gurney. The only facial features that stick out in my mind now are that it had slanted eyes, 2 holes where its nose should have been, and a small slit where its mouth should have been. I think it was alive. The medical people were mostly just staring at it, but I'm not sure. After the rest of the gurneys were brought into the room, I was dismissed and told to return to my squadron, which I did. There, I was debriefed and made to sign a non-disclosure statement regarding what had just taken place. I was told that if I ever spoke about it, something bad would happen, not only to me, but also to my family. I heard later that the one species that was still alive was apparently taken to Alamogordo, then shipped to Texas or Ohio.
Imagine those 15 minutes.
Yeah. That's crazy.
And you get a look at something that blows your fucking mind, and then you are told to never speak about it and never get any real answers, just rumors for the rest of your fucking life.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, he says it right there, not human. I mean, just those two words alone should let you know what we're talking about.
And this guy was found, he didn't say anything forever. He was one of these guys that followed order. And in fact, after he told this story to Thomas Carey and Donald Schmitt for Witness to Roswell, the first thing according to them, that he said after he told that story was, well, do you think I'm going to lose my pension?
Isn't that crazy? That's all he could think about.
As an old man, because he was just terrified that letting this out of the bag was going to fuck up his life.
Yeah.
And this is why, and you got to think, these were the guys who were still alive. Think about Bryce, how many people do you think were in this base hospital when these bodies came in?
Oh my God. Dozens, if not dozens upon dozens. Look, I think the witnesses go the same way as UFO reporting and Bigfoot reportings, right? Like only 10% go on record. So, this caseload of witnesses with these deathbed confessions really only represent a small percentage of the people who were actually there, who saw more than even this guy.
And as of like the mid to late 2000s, we don't have them anymore. Isn't that fucking insane?
Yeah.
And it's these first. This is the difference between the Frankie Dwyer story, which is fascinating, and this is a firsthand account. This is a guy who never spoke about this for 50 years, and finally talks about it, and he's still scared that he's going to lose his pension.
It's incredible.
Wow.
Glenn Dennis was an embalmist at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. On July 8th, he began receiving calls from military doctors and nurses from the base, first asking if he had any child-sized caskets available.
Mm-hmm.
And then shortly after, numerous calls asking about the embalming process and how to move the dead.
Yeah, and Michael...
No reason.
Yeah.
For a friend. It's just a friend.
What?
Don't worry. It's nothing.
Did some kids die? What's going on?
That's just a
hold
project.
On. Wait a minute.
Nothing.
What?
Oh my gosh. Michael mentioned it earlier, but another interesting little side note, besides the strange requests made by the base for children's caskets, the base also made last-minute orders of large amounts of dry ice, which Clardy's Dairy delivered to the base.
Just to make it spookier in there?
Yeah.
Get a little fog going.
Totally.
Yeah, they basically, guys, I know it's a little early, but this would make a wicked haunted house.
It's a little on the nose, but a bit of fog in here would really amp it up.
These bodies are going to go bad, so let's get this going now. Make a couple bucks.
Right. And Michael mentioned earlier, the Roswell Army Airfield, they did have a hospital on the base, right? But they did not have a morgue or their own ambulance and EMT services, which is why the base had a private contract with Glenn Dennis and the Ballard Funeral Home.
And that'll come into play in a minute here. So Dennis figured that there must have been a plane crash, but children's coffins? That wasn't something the Ballard home had on hand. They would need to be special ordered, and apparently the base dismissed the idea and moved on. Later that afternoon, Dennis was called out to pick up an officer who had been in a motorcycle crash and bring him back to base. And this is where this is why he would come out and use the Ballard vehicle as an ambulance. So often he was picking up guys and bringing them to base and going to and from base. So he had a pass to get on the base.
That's right.
And when he arrived at the airfield with his patient, he discovered a lot of activity. Well, not his patient, the patient, you know what I mean. He discovered a lot of activity happening at the base hospital. His mind spinning with the strange phone calls from earlier, Dennis decided to see what the fuss was all about. As he got out of the car, he approached the base hospital and noticed a number of box-type military ambulances parked out front. One of the trucks had its door hanging open, and Dennis caught a glimpse of a bluish, metallic, canoe-like structure within. The strange object had mysterious symbols that adorned its surface. Once inside the hospital, Dennis quickly bumped into a panicked, nauseous nurse who greeted him with terror.
What are you doing here? Get out! Get out as quickly as you can, or you will be in a lot of trouble!
That's when an unnamed sergeant and a red-headed captain walked out into the hallway and ordered Glenn Dennis to remove himself from the hospital, or he too might soon be in need of an embalmer himself.
Threatened.
Glenn protested, saying he saw the wreckage and wanted to know what was going on. After all, he was a civilian, and he didn't have to take orders from the military. The red-headed captain called Dennis a son of a bitch, telling him that there had been no crash, and if he didn't want to end up dead in the desert, he would need to leave immediately.
Threatened again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Carry on. Redheaded captain. There was another redheaded captain, right?
Yeah. This rings a bell, okay? This is when I start to circle back again to this fucking archaeological student.
Barney Barnett
story, because apparently a redheaded captain had told them to get the fuck out of the way. So maybe there's some truth to this Barney Barnett story in the Plains of San Augustine. I think I called it Plains of St. Augustine last episode. Who the fuck knows? But still, it doesn't add up because his wife said he wasn't in town that day, and that was 140 miles away from the crash site. I don't get it. But still, it's a weird note that I don't think the authors of the books we've read put those two together.
Yeah.
Maybe there were just a lot more gingers in 1947.
It's possible.
Angry gingers. Days after the activity at the base hospital, Glenn Dennis met up for lunch with the mystery nurse at the officers' club. She was still visibly shook by what she had witnessed that day. In urgent whispers and conspiratorial tones, she revealed to the mortician that she'd been supplying the hospital stockroom on the day in question when a military doctor pulled her into the autopsy room to take notes. Once inside, the nurse was hit with a wave of foul stench. She immediately noticed 3 dead, quote-unquote, foreign bodies, as she described them, 2 of which had been mutilated by the crash and subsequently mangled by desert predators. The military doctors were most interested in the body that was well intact. As she described the entities to Glenn Dennis, the nurse's shaking hand drew a picture on a paper napkin. The image was of a creature 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with long arms and a thin body. The nurse explained that the heads were bald, oversized, and fragile-looking, like that of a newborn baby. As other alleged witnesses had described, each hand had 4 fingers at the ends of which, according to the nurse, were small suction cup-like tips. She had become so overwhelmed by the stench of the bodies that she became sick to her stomach and asked to be excused. That's when she ran out into the hall and into Glenn Dennis.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah, and this nurse is a really mysterious figure. Glenn Dennis never revealed who she was. He protected her identity. That she said, "I'll tell you about this if you promise to me that you'll never let anyone know I told you."
Yeah.
And he kind of sent Carey and Schmitt down a little bit of a wild goose chase trying to figure out who she was. And at one point even made up a name for her, and they started to distrust him as a witness. But he made a promise to this woman. And according to Dennis, and maybe again this is just part of him protecting her, she was soon again transferred to England,
transferred.
Where after a couple months, he wrote a letter and then got it sent back saying that the recipient was deceased.
Yeah, crazy.
That being said, Carey and Schmitt and Witness to Roswell got a lead from someone who knew somebody who thought that maybe this nurse was a woman named Mary Crowley Lowe. And they tracked her down. She was living, I believe, in Texas in the early 2000s, late 90s, and got a little bit out of her, maybe some stuff admitting that she had been at Roswell at the time, but she ultimately refused to discuss with them the case. And when they floated this past Glenn Dennis, he was like, "Oh yeah, Mary, she knows everything," and then realized what he had said and called them back later and was like, "Oh, by the way, never mind what I said. Mary doesn't know anything," because they have a feeling that she called Glenn and was like, "What the fuck are you? Yeah, what the fuck are you doing? Going talking to these investigators about who I am and what I saw." So this identity of this nurse remains a mystery. But it's still a really fascinating story. Another point that I think failed to mention is that witnesses would also say that the 4 fingers on the aliens would have a little bit of webbing at the base in between each finger.
Yeah. Strange. Suction cupped fingers, webbing, lizards type scales, insect like heads, strange little buggers.
She corroborated that they had that sort of beaded reptilian kind of skin.
No, I don't know how anybody's going to confuse that with a human, but...
And you got to remember that Glenn Dennis, I mean, he did go on to be sort of a researcher on this story himself. I would understand why if he saw what he saw. But, you know, it's not like he spoke to Eli Benjamin about the bodies. You know what I mean? It's not like he ever got to talk to other... I mean, as far as we know, these people weren't sharing this information.
Now... Another chilling testimony comes from a lady by the name of Miriam Andrea Bush, who was the secretary to Lieutenant Colonel Harold M. Warren, who was the commanding medical officer at the RAAF base hospital. She was handpicked due to her background and intelligence. Now, Miriam was not prepared for what would happen to her that day. From all the eyewitness accounts, something highly unusual was happening at the base hospital that day. Unfamiliar doctors and nurses were flown in and rushing into and out of the halls as the regular staff were ordered back to their living quarters. Military police were posted around the perimeter of the main emergency corridor. One should keep in mind, this hospital was no stranger to a bad day. Training exercises had gone horribly wrong in the past. Mangled plane crash victims, badly burned bodies. These things were not completely out of the ordinary. But on this day, July 8th, make no mistake about it, something extraordinary was taking place. And when Lieutenant Colonel Wayne was pushed aside by specialists he didn't recognize, he grabbed his secretary Miriam by the arm and quietly led her right into the examination room, saying, "You need to see this." That's when she observed a number of bodies on gurneys in the middle of the room and screamed,
"My God, they're children!"
But upon closer inspection, she soon realized that their body size was their only childlike quality. Their skin was grayish to brown in tone, and the heads that peeked out from behind the linens were so large, and the eyes, those godforsaken staring eyes wouldn't shut. They would haunt her. It was only when one of the bodies moved that she was pushed out. Recalling the story to her father that night, all she could do was weep. So there it is again, another first-hand account of an alive alien body.
Yeah, and the eyes keep coming up. Montoya said that he could see the eyes. He wasn't close enough to get their color, but one of the things he also described was how big the eyes were on these entities. Speaking of eyes, according to eyewitness accounts recorded in UFO Crash at Roswell and Witness to Roswell, after the autopsies were conducted, the bodies were packed in dry ice in a wooden crate and stored in an empty bomb pit on the base that was typically used for weapon storage, and guarded by men who had no clue what was inside the box. On the morning of July 9th, so now we're on Wednesday of the week. We finally got to Wednesday after 3 episodes. Just shows you how busy this fucking week was. The wreckage was loaded up onto C-4 planes and flown to Los Alamos, Kirtland, and Wright Base in Ohio. The crate with the bodies was removed from the bomb pit and flown on the straight flush by Pappy Henderson to Fort Worth, where the cargo would be transferred for its ultimate destination, Wright Air Base. And Henderson, when he flew in to Fort Worth, he picked up Marcel, who had actually, I think we got this wrong in the last episode, he spent 24 hours in Fort Worth and flew back with Henderson on the straight flush. And that's a slight correction from last week when I said that Marcel went out to the base on straight flush. He actually came back to the base on that plane.
Baby, sorry, totally side note here. This is creepy. I'm at my buddy's house upstairs in his office, and Baby is barking at a closed closet door.
Okay.
So
good.
Yeah.
Do you want to go take a look at what's in that closet?
Yeah. Hold on, I'll keep recording. Stand by. Baby, what are you doing? What is in here?
What if we hear him get abducted?
Swing it open.
Oh my God, it would be the best radio ever.
Oh my God! Charlie! Oh, you little shit! Oh, God damn it! Well, there was definitely something in the closet.
Oh my God!
Totally got.
Did you set that up?
No, God,
what?
God! I was wondering who let the dog up, but oh my God, Charlie, you little bastard!
Oh my gosh.
God, she got me good too.
Scared the shit out of you.
Oh my God. I had the goosebumps because I felt like, oh my God, I feel like something's in there. Oh my God.
Oh wow.
She's gonna go later.
Oh my God, where were
Charlie
we?
is a genius.
Oh my God. Sorry,
she's a comedic genius.
Okay, you were at Henderson picked up Marcel.
Yeah, so Henderson flew Marcel back on Wednesday. That's when Marcel got back to the base and talked to Cavett and was like, hey, what the hell happened while I was gone? I want to see the reports. And Cavett was like, no can do, buddy. And also just a technical note, when they flew the straight flush and the bodies to Fort Worth, they talked about how the cabin wasn't pressurized, so they had to fly at a low altitude.
All very strange.
Yeah, which is kind of, not normal.
Authors Carey and Schmitt are often asked where the bodies are today. And while they cannot say for certain, they do know that immediately following their retrieval, they were flown out of Roswell with an ultimate destination of Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, home to the Air Technical Intelligence Division.
Sorry.
Which would...
I just started thinking about you saying again.
I got, brah.
Sorry, go on. Here
yes.
we go.
Home to the Air Technical Intelligence Division, which would later become the Foreign Technology Division. However, it is rumored that throughout the years, the bodies recovered from the crash in Roswell were quote-unquote loaned around to select secure military facilities for examination. Rumors even began to circulate that the live alien was spotted in and around above top-secret rooms at Wright Field. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Marion Magruder claimed that his Air War College class was flown to Wright Air Force Base in the spring of 1948, and while there, according to Magruder, the class was shown some of the Roswell wreckage and even, yep, you guessed it, the live alien.
Welcome to Wright Air Base, class number 1138. I am your extraterrestrial professor, Galoob, with a hard G. Today we'll be covering the absence of reproductive organs on your trees. Why don't they have any? They have them all over my planet.
One anonymous insider claims that the lone survivor of the Roswell crash was kept alive at Wright until 1952, when it was accidentally killed in an experiment being conducted on it.
Oh, dick move.
So, yeah, right? Like, what happened with the live alien? What happened with the live drone? Did they
the live
Did
alien
they ship it somewhere?
This is the stuff of legends. This is to me when, like, okay, I think we're really getting into like myth making here. This is what the movie Paul is based on.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised. that there was something still alive when they found the bodies. I mean, I can kind of wrap my brain around that, but whether it survived for like years later is so creepy and so sad, because it's also like, why didn't his friends come get him? Like,
well, yeah. Well, and it's because he's a drone. He's a scout drone, and it speaks to like not being, I don't know, biological in a sense. Like maybe this thing didn't need oxygen, food to survive, you know?
It's like losing your iPhone or like an app on a living app.
Totally.
It's like losing your GPS.
God.
It's just like, all right, whatever. We'll grow another one.
I mean, I do have that problem with like some officer at Wright being like, okay, I know the tour's over, but I really want to bring out something cool. Okay. Galoob, come on out here, buddy. So it's that's hard to wrap your head around.
There was a rumor as early as the week of all of this happening after July 9th that around Roswell that an alien had escaped the base.
Oh yeah, I love this.
Running around the suburbs, and that the military had to catch it and kill it.
Well,
so this live alien thing, the rumor of the live alien was the myth of that, whether it was based in reality or not, started that week. I mean, that's just like part of the genesis of this story.
Well, even think about the townspeople of Roswell. There was even like rumors that a live one had gotten away from the crash and was like hiding in and around town. You know, people.
That's what I just said.
Oh, I thought you meant at Wright Air Force Base. Oh, right.
No.
Okay.
At Roswell, like on July 9th. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. As early as the week all of this happened, there were already stories forming of an escaped live alien.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, it's wild. Oh, the other thing that we didn't mention about the bodies, the nurse brought up that there, instead of blood, there was like a translucent liquid in them that had no red blood cells, which is another thing that supports the idea that this wasn't like a real living, regular biological entity, at least certainly not from Earth.
I got to go back and change my watercolor painting then.
I think you do, because you got to just use the translucence of your tears to paint the alien blood.
Watercolor change.
really pushing it with this sound effect.
Right, my bad.
So before we conclude, let's look back and recap the Roswell timeline we've been trying to put together over the past few weeks.
Should we?
June? Oh, yeah.
I was going to say, should we do it over yakety sax?
No.
Okay.
This is the peak of my my month's work.
Right. Here we go.
All right, Bryce, why don't you kick us off?
Let's do it. June 24th to July 2nd, 1947. Reports of flying saucers start to sweep the nation. These flying discs are seen across the country, but are heavily concentrated in the Pacific Northwest and the American Southwest.
July 2nd through 3rd, 1947, Roswell hardware store owner Dan Wilmot and his wife spot a large glowing object shooting across the sky at high speed. They describe it as looking oval-shaped, like two inverted bowls touching mouth to mouth. Wilmot guesstimated the craft was 5 feet in height and 12 to 15 feet in diameter. William Woody and his father, who lived east of Roswell, saw a fiery object falling out of the night sky. Eyewitnesses spread across western New Mexico's far north of Santa Fe claimed to have seen a mysterious fireball streaking overhead in the direction of Roswell.
July 4th weekend. After a late-night storm, ranch foreman Mac Brazel and neighbor boy Dee Proctor discovered a large debris field on the Foster Ranch in Corona, New Mexico, about 76 miles northwest of Roswell. Brazel and other ranchers marvel at the strange, unbreakable, shape-shifting metal found along the debris. He showed the wreckage to Dee's parents, Floyd and Loretta Proctor. Rumors start spreading that one of those flying saucers had crash-landed in their small community. Brazel stores some of the debris in his cabin. He, Dee Proctor, and another young ranch kid, Sidney Jack Wright, possibly see dead alien bodies 2.5 miles away from the debris field.
Sunday, July 6th through Tuesday, July 8th. In need of assistance with cleanup and in hopes of a big reward for retrieving a genuine flying saucer, Brazel drives a small collection of debris into Roswell to show Sheriff Wilcox. During his visit, the local radio station KGFL calls for news updates, and Brazel's put on the line. He tells DJ Frank Joyce that he found a flying saucer and hints that there are small bodies that aren't human. Colonel William Blanchard, commanding officer of the Roswell Army Airfield, gets involved and assigns Intelligence Officer Major Jesse Marcel Sr. and Counterintelligence Officer Sheridan Cavett to survey the debris field. By Monday, July 7th, the Army begins taking over the ranch and collecting the debris for themselves. Rumors keep spreading of a crashed saucer north of town. By Tuesday, Lieutenant William Hout, on orders by Blanchard, sends out a press release claiming that the U.S. Army has recovered a flying disc. The story is printed that afternoon in 30 papers across the country, most notably in the Roswell Daily Record.
Meanwhile, Marcel is sent with debris to General Roger Ramey in Fort Worth, Texas, where he watched in disbelief as the materials he collected are swapped out with the rubber, wood, and tinfoil of a simple weather balloon. The cover-up story goes into full effect, with the FCC telling radio stations in the Southwest that they will lose their license if they report on the story, citing national security matters. Ramey conducts a press conference from Fort Worth declaring the whole thing was a mix-up. There is no flying saucer, and they certainly won't be sending any mysterious debris to higher command. Marcel is forced to take a picture with the weather balloon, which hits the newspapers on July 9th with the retracted story. Mac Brazel is also forced to retract his story under military escort and kept at the base for the next 5 to 6 days.
All the while, back in Corona, the Army starts rounding up materials confiscated from the debris field by locals. Civilians and officers alike are told not to talk about what they've seen, and in some cases are threatened with violence and death threats that extend to their families. At some point between the late afternoon of July 7th and the morning hours of July 8th, the impact site of the craft, also known as the third crash site, is discovered. Melvin Brown gets a glimpse of the bodies just before they and the wreckage are shipped back to RAAF for examination. Two paperboys witness a giant flatbed truck driving down Main Street towards the base with an egg-shaped craft or cockpit barely visible beneath the tarp. Lieutenant Governor Joe Montoya gets a peek at the bodies and maybe the wreckage while visiting the base and promptly loses it. Glenn Dennis receives calls from the base asking for child-sized coffins. He delivers an injured soldier to RAAF, where he sees a truck full of wreckage and runs into a panicked nurse who has just left an autopsy room full of alien bodies. Dennis is threatened by military brass and escorted out of the hospital.
Wednesday, July 9th. The remaining bodies are kept on ice in a wooden crate in a bomb pit at the base until finally being flown out to Fort Worth on the straight flush, piloted by Captain Pappy Henderson. From there, the bodies are sent on to Wright Base in Dayton, Ohio, where they become the stuff of legend, and the United States government begins a decades-long denial of the existence of UFOs, even while funding programs to study the phenomenon. Henderson flies a dejected Marcel back to RAAF, where he demands to see reports on what went on during his absence. Sheridan Cavett refuses to let Marcel see the reports based on commands he received from Washington. Blanchard tells Marcel to forget it and keep quiet about what he saw. Marcel goes home to his family to deliver the news to his wife V and his son Jesse Marcel Jr. that they are not allowed to talk about the debris he showed them in the wee hours of Monday, July 7th. Little Jesse Jr. will never forget that moment, and as an adult, before his death, will back up his dying father's claims that the military conducted the biggest cover-up of all time, that they willingly kept secret the proof of extraterrestrial life from not only the American public, but humanity at large.
So what do we make of all of this? Hundreds of witnesses have come forward in the 73 years since the Roswell incident. Are their accounts, often told to investigators second or third hand, enough proof that whatever crashed at Roswell came from another world? Simply put, no. But collectively, These voices, passed down now through multiple witnesses, weave a compelling tale that is hard to ignore or dismiss outright. We may not have the proof we need to solve the Roswell mystery, but thanks to the hard work of people like Stanton Friedman, Kevin D. Randle, Tom Carey, Donald Schmitt, and countless others, the story has not been lost. The memories of the men and women who bore witness to the event are still alive in the telling. And as long as the story remains alive, hope remains that one day the world will finally know the truth. Perhaps everything we need to know was right there in plain type with the Daily Record's headline, RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region.
For those of you who remain skeptical, we'd like to provide the final piece of evidence. It's not proof, but it's one hell of a story. This is the sealed deathbed confession of Lieutenant Walter Haut. You'll remember him as the guy who sent out the press release about the flying saucer on orders of Colonel Blanchard. Before he died, Haut wrote this confession, which was to remain sealed until after his death. To the shock of his family and his closest friends, Haut, who never directly admitted that he'd seen any wreckage or bodies or that the Roswell story was true, had this to say.
Sealed affidavit of Walter G. Haut. My name is Walter G. Haut. I was born June 3rd, 1922. My address is 2801 North Kentucky 142, Roswell, New Mexico. I'm retired. In July 1947, I was stationed at the Roswell Army Base in Roswell, New Mexico, serving as the base public information officer. I had spent the 4th of July weekend, Saturday the 5th and Sunday the 6th, at my private residence about 10 miles north of the base, which was located south of town. I was aware that someone had reported the remains of a downed vehicle by mid-morning after my return to duty at the base on Monday, July 7th. I was aware that Major Jesse A. Marcel, head of intelligence, was sent by the base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, to investigate. By late in the afternoon that same day, I would learn that additional civilian reports came in regarding a second site just north of Roswell. I would spend the better part of the day attending to my regular duties, hearing little, if anything, more. On Tuesday, July 8th, I would attend the regularly scheduled staff meeting at 7:30 a.m. Besides Blanchard, Marcel, CIC Captain Sheridan Cavett, Colonel James I. Hopkins, the operations officer, Major Patrick Saunders, the base adjutant, Major Isidore Brown, the personal officer, Lieutenant Colonel Ulysses S. Nero, the supply officer, and from Carswell AAF in North Fort Worth, Texas, Blanchard's boss, Brigadier General Roger Ramey, and his chief of staff, Colonel Thomas J. DuBose, were also in attendance. This is Michael interrupting here. Side note, first time that we've heard that Roger Ramey may have been at this meeting? It's very strange. Again, contradictions abound. Maybe he was on the phone. We don't know. Let's get back to this. It's about to get good. The main topic of discussion was reported by Marcel and Cavett regarding an extensive debris field in Lincoln County, approximately 75 miles northwest of Roswell. A preliminary briefing was provided by Blanchard about the second site, approximately 40 miles north of town. Samples of wreckage were passed around the table. It was unlike any material I had or have ever seen in my life. Pieces which resembled metal foil, paper thin and yet extremely strong, and pieces with unusual markings along their length were handed from man to man, each voicing their opinion. No one was able to identify the crashed debris. One of the main concerns discussed at the meeting was whether we should go public or not with the discovery. General Ramey proposed a plan which I believe originated with his bosses at the Pentagon. Attention needed to be diverted from the more important site north of town by acknowledging the other location. Too many civilians were already involved and the press was already informed. I was not completely informed on how this would be accomplished. At approximately 9:30, Colonel Blanchard phoned my office and dictated the press release of having in our possession a flying disc, coming from a ranch northwest of Roswell, and Marcel flying the material to higher headquarters. I was to deliver the news release to radio stations KGFL and KSWS and newspapers, the Daily Record and the Morning Dispatch. By the time the news had hit the wire services, my office was inundated with phone calls from around the world, messages stacked up on my desk, and rather than deal with the media concern, Colonel Blanchard suggested that I go home and hide out. Before leaving the base, Colonel Blanchard took me personally to Building 84, a B-29 hangar located on the east side of the tarmac. Upon first approaching the building, I observed that it was under heavy guard both outside and inside. Once inside, I was permitted from a safe distance to first observe the object just recovered north of town. It was approximately 12 to 15 feet in length, but not quite as wide, about 6 feet high and more of an egg shape. Lighting was poor, but its surface did not appear metallic. No windows, portholes, wings, tail section, or landing gear was visible. Also from a distance, I was able to see a couple of bodies under a canvas tarpaulin. Only the heads extended beyond the covering, and I was not able to make out any features. The heads did appear larger than normal, and the contour of the canvas over the body suggested the size of a 10-year-old child. At a later date, in Blanchard's office, he would extend his arm about 4 feet above the floor to indicate the height. I was informed of a temporary morgue set up to accommodate the recovered bodies. I was informed that the wreckage was not hot, radioactive. Upon his return from Fort Worth, Major Marcel described to me taking pieces of the wreckage to General Ramey's office, and after returning from a map room, finding the remains of a weather balloon and radar kits substituted while he was out of the room. Marcel was very upset over this situation. We would not discuss it again. I would be allowed to make at least one visit to one of the recovery sites during the military cleanup. I would return to the base with some of the wreckage, which I would display in my office. I was aware of 2 separate teams, which would return to each site months later for periodic searches for any remaining evidence. I am convinced that what I personally observed was some type of craft and its crew from outer space. I have not been paid nor given anything of value to make this statement, and it is the truth to the best of my recollection. This statement is to be remain sealed and secured until the time of my death, and at which time my surviving family will determine its disposition. Signed, Walter G. Howe.
Wow.
December 26, 2002.
There you go.
Wow.
There's the whole story, man.
I mean, I got to say, you guys have kind of blown my mind today.
All right. All right.
I mean, seems pretty clear. These are bioengineered drone pilots made by a conscious AI that's exploring its roots in life throughout the universe.
Well, Riley, you couldn't have set us up for a new game that we're about to play with you, the man that we've told this story to over the past 3 weeks.
All right.
Get ready for Roswell bullshit
or believe it.
Oh, God.
Super producer Riley.
Oh, God.
You ready?
Yeah, ready.
On your mark. Get set. Goats, sheep, and cattle are just a few types of the kind of livestock commonly found on a southwestern ranch.
Believe it.
The flying saucer flap of 1947 was just a case of mass hysteria.
Bullshit.
Aliens had the ability to manifest their appearance based on the collective consciousness of humanity.
Believe it.
Jesse Marcel Sr. was a good dad for letting his kid play with off-world materials.
Oh, believe it. Hard.
Roger Ramey intentionally lied to the American public about the Roswell crash.
Believe it.
The object that crashed was a weather balloon.
A bullshit.
Cowboys are too stupid to recognize man-made materials.
Well, that's some bullshit.
Alien bodies were found by a group of archaeological students and a civil engineer redundantly named Barney Barnett.
That one, bullshit. Sorry.
Alien bodies were found.
Believe it.
Mortician Glenn Dennis received calls from the Army inquiring about child-sized coffins.
I mean, believe it. Why would he make that up?
The Roswell crash should officially be renamed the Corona crash.
Believe it.
The debris discovered by Mac Brazel came from a top secret military program.
Oh, God. That's the thing, though, guys. Because kind of believe it, but I don't know. Maybe it's a top secret military program that's already involved with this thing that we're talking about, and maybe it can be both. Sorry.
One of the aliens made it out of Roswell alive.
Bullshit.
Our government opened up Pandora's box by covering up the visitation of extraterrestrial visitors from outer space, and by doing so have created a giant gaping hole in government trust by the American people, which has led to unfettered special access programs with alien tech leapfrogging over our own civilian space agencies.
Believe it.
Oh, yeah.
Riley Bray, you've just played Roswell Bullshit or Believe It.
Wow, that was exciting. I am literally sweating.
Well done. Well done.
Brother, you and me both. My computer is crying from everything that I've put it through.
Oh, my God. Wow.
This one was a doozy.
Woo.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say.
Not
You
easy
guys
to
are really
prove aliens are real, but we did it. We did it here today.
You did it. I think you've done it here today.
Beautiful.
It's conclusive. Yeah.
Beautiful.
We called it on ghosts way back when.
Yeah.
We're calling it.
aliens today.
Aliens are real.
Groundbreaking.
So, Riley, what do you think? I mean, where are you now compared to where you were when we started this story?
Well, a lot more informed, for one. I feel like I have such a better grasp on this whole thing, and it really is an awesome story with so many very well-crafted characters. Before I kind of just thought it was like folklore, sci-fi, kitschy kind of story that people tell. Now I think it's very clear that it's an example of a massive cover-up in the beginnings of the military-industrial complex and that whole situation, which we were warned about coming out of World War II, and that's a fascinating angle all on its own.
Yeah.
And beyond that, I mean, it's like I could kind of echoing what Ryan had said before is like, this could be like some weird early space program stuff, or it could be extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
But it is the one thing I can say with absolute certainty is that it's not a fucking weather balloon.
Yeah, I totally look. That's the space program stuff. We're still about 10 years early on that stuff. So, I mean, it just doesn't make sense that look, Operation High Dive, to give you an example, didn't start until 1959, and that's when they officially started, dropping dummies from high altitude balloons to see the impact.
Right.
So I mean, the space program didn't really even get started until the early 60s, mid 60s. So
totally,
to think that this is some, and these are guys that handled the atomic bomb. For them to sit around a conference table passing this stuff around going, what the fuck is this? Just speaks to the outer worldliness of this material.
Yeah. It's very hard to dismiss. I mean, and like you said, it's very early for this to be any kind of space program thing. It just, the timelines don't quite add up, but it's something.
Because I'm just thinking about the story of the Glock, the Die Glock, the Nazi bell, and the Nazis were trying to develop UFOs and flying saucers. Maybe they were testing, there's the V2 rocket. Maybe they're testing some early high altitude shit that backfired,
Yeah, and everyone's on a need to know basis, so people aren't knowing about other projects. I mean, that's kind of where my mind goes for the terrestrial explanation.
Because this is my skeptical point of view, is because it is, as Bryce would say, convenient that this thing crashed near where all of these top secret programs were going on.
Right.
So
Hard to ignore.
If it fell in Mackinac Island, where there's no real military presence and no testing going on, and there aren't Nazi scientists that are helping them build bigger, better bombs, the US bombs, then I don't know. But that being said, when you hear that affidavit from Walter Haut, it's really hard to ignore. When you hear some of these old timers talk about on their deathbeds, I know what I saw, and what I saw was not from this planet. That is very hard to ignore. So I think if they were aliens and they did crash for whatever reason, this is probably how it would go down. You know what I mean? This is probably like no one in this story to me is acting dishonestly or counterintuitively of how they would have handled this situation. So I think there's truth in the story and the way that the story unfolds.
Totally. And the accounts ring true. Like, this does not sound like, made up or crazy or hysteria. It all rings true. And it's just, what do you make of all this evidence, which is a lot of evidence that it's inconclusive, but it's a lot of evidence.
Yeah. I mean, and look, just because, we've gone over all that this is doesn't mean that there aren't, out of bounds explanations for this. There's so many theories that, this could be us from the future that still haven't perfected time travel. And yet we get back here at a time when we're developing the atomic weapon. And who knows? These could be drones that we made from the future, sent back in time. There seems to be, look, you can't deny there seems to be some sort of fascination or obsession with these entities or the phenomenon in general about nuclear annihilation, about what we're doing to our planet, about, atomic weapons in general. And it seems to be launched right at the perfect doorstep of where we were really developing these and deploying these types of weapon. I don't know. It's all so very strange.
It's at the beginning of the space age for sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
and look,
they're coming to be like, knock it off, you dummies.
And look, if like even Ryan was saying, some of these metallic properties, these isotopic properties seem to be from some sort of, high tech, airplane that we might be developing from some aeronautical thing. Who's to say that, this could be a psychic manifestation of something here on Earth that represented itself in the form of a flying disc and little gray aliens that landed right at the doorstep of the 509th. I'm not saying this could be from extraterrestrial or outer space. This could be a psychic manifestation of us terrestrial Earthlings manifested in form at Roswell, New Mexico.
Far out. I like that.
Well, we hope you guys, the listeners, have gone on a wild ride along with us. We're interested to hear on what your thoughts are about what really happened in Roswell. So please share your comments in our Instagram at Bigfoot Collectors Club. Follow us for more updates on Twitter at Bigfoot Pod. And please do us a favor. Go over to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star review so more people like you can discover the podcast. And if you do, we will read possibly your 5-star review on the show, like this one that I am about to pull up right now.
Excellent stalling for time.
Thank you, sir. My computer, like I said, is dying. Let's look at these ratings and reviews. Here we go. Wow. This is from What's Really Going On. Flipping great. A gazillion times beyond expectations. 5 stars. You guys are great in this format. Ouch. Must have been regressed. Oh, I think they're referring to this multi-arc format that we're doing right now. Thank you so much.
Oh, nice.
Really appreciate what's really going on. Please share your opinion of what you think really went on with Roswell. Boys, I'm exhausted, and I think it's time for a well-deserved weekend break. This has been, honestly, so much fun.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is and we definitely will do bigger stories like this in the future, and maybe we'll even go back to some of our old stories in the case files and maybe do some deeper dives. But thanks so much for you guys supporting the show and listening to this and being excited about switching it up. We're really happy to do something a little bit more ambitious, and we hope it paid off. We want to give a big thanks to Ryan Sprague for joining us on the show, and a huge thank you to our amazing cast of actors that did special appearances for all of our characters. In alphabetical order, thank you to Eric Edelstein, W. David Keith, Kevin Kirkpatrick, Jen Kirkman, Burl Moseley, Alllison Munn, and Gabrielle Ruiz.
Amen to that. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you two for putting in all the research on this. I feel like I've really gotten a primer on the subject.
It was so much fun. Yeah.
I got to clean this goddamn apartment is what has to happen. All right, boys. Well, let's call it a night. Until next week, good night.
And go get regressed.
All right. The marathon is run.
Bigfoot Collectors Club is produced by Riley Bray. Our theme song is Come Alone by Suneaters, courtesy of Lotuspool Records. If you like the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It really helps get the podcast to more listeners. To support the show, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/Bigfoot Collectors Club and unlock multiple reward episodes every month.